Hello everyone, I am the Creep's Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I was 21 years old when I moved into my new apartment, just around the corner from an old church. It was one of those places with a history, the kind you could feel in your bones when you walked by. The church itself was ancient, made of dark stone that had seen centuries pass, its structure weathered by time, its stained glass windows always seeming to watch. Across from it was a large park, but it hadn't always been a park. It used to be a cemetery, and even though the city had reclaimed it, turning it into a public space, the past still clung to it. The old, faded headstones had been pulled from the ground and lined the walls of the park, a silent reminder of what the land once was. Between the park and the church, there was a narrow footpath. It was well lit, a shortcut often used by pedestrians during the day. But at night, it emptied out, swallowed by silence. People avoided it after dark. I didn't question why. I just knew I wouldn't be using it either. It was my third night living in the area when my younger sister, 19 at the time, and I made our final trip home from the tube station. We were pulling large suitcases behind us, loaded with the last of our things, the wheels clattering against the pavement. The station was a good walk from our apartment, and the night air was cool as we trudged forward. As we approached the church, I hesitated. The quiet back path was right there, a straight shot toward home, but I couldn't bring myself to step onto it. The thought of walking in near silence, with only the sound of our suitcases rolling over the pavement, made my stomach twist. Two young women, alone, in a place like that? I didn't want to risk it. Better to walk in front of the church, I thought. The main road was just ahead, lined with streetlights and filled with the hum of passing cars. It felt safer. The pavement was wide, the area brightly lit. The choice seemed obvious, but I was wrong. Just as we passed the front entrance of the church, I saw her. She was standing near the large iron gates, facing the church, moving slowly. So slowly it almost didn't look like movement at all. Her back was to us. She was old, in her 80s at least, her small, frail body hunched slightly. Her hair was completely white, wispy strands visible under the dull glow of the nearest streetlight. She was dressed in all white t-shirt, white shorts, white sneakers. Even from behind, something about her felt off. I glanced to the side and noticed her mobility scooter sitting just a few feet away. That struck me as strange. If she needed it, why wasn't she using it? And what was she doing there alone at this hour? There were no lights on in the church. The trees surrounding the compound made it even darker. Even with the traffic rushing past on the main road, the area around the church felt separate, like it was tucked away in some unreachable pocket of night. Then she started laughing. A sharp, piercing laugh that rang out through the air like a sudden explosion. I froze. It was high-pitched, almost shrill, carrying through the night in a way that made my skin crawl. The sound was unnatural, like the kind of laughter that came from someone who had long since lost control of their mind. I didn't want to look back at her. I didn't want to see if she had turned around. A deep, gut-wrenching instinct screamed at me to move. Go. Now. I grabbed my sister's arm, yanking her forward. We picked up the pace, but the laughter didn't stop. It only grew louder. It didn't just sound louder, it felt closer. We were moving fast, our suitcases bumping along the pavement, the noise lost under the sound of that manic, shrieking laughter. My breath was coming quicker, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. My skin was crawling with the sensation that someone was right behind me, reaching, stretching toward me. But I didn't hear any footsteps. No shuffling, no rustling of clothing. Just that laugh. It felt like it was right at my back. The further we got from the church, the more frantic the laughter became. Like it was following us, like it was chasing us, but without moving. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to see what was behind me. My sister was barely keeping up, dragging her suitcase behind her as we half ran, half speed walked down the pavement. Then, out of nowhere, a cyclist shot toward us. He came from the opposite direction, swerving close. "Boo!" he shouted. A sick, twisted joke. I screamed. The cyclist laughed and sped past, oblivious to the absolute terror he had just worsened. My legs nearly gave out beneath me. My sister yanked my arm, snapping me back to reality, and we kept moving. The laughter was still there, still following. still too close. Then, suddenly, it stopped. Not slowly fading, not drifting off. It just cut out all at once. Silence rushed in so quickly, it almost felt deafening. We didn't stop until we reached the front door of our apartment building. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip them. I had to force myself to breathe. Finally, we got inside. The heavy door slammed shut behind us. My first thought was to check if she was still there. I turned, pressing my face to the small glass window in the door. The street was empty. No old woman. No movement. For a moment, I genuinely thought I had imagined it. That maybe my own fear had twisted something completely normal into something horrifying. Then my sister turned to me. "You saw her too, right?" I nodded. We stood there, our breathing still ragged, staring at each other in the dimly lit hallway. I tried to laugh, tried to shake it off. But before I could, the doorbell rang. The sound ripped through the air, a deep, electric buzz that sent my heart slamming against my ribs. I screamed, an instinctual, panicked reaction that I couldn't hold back. My sister jumped, spinning toward the door. We weren't expecting anyone. We had just run inside. Who the hell was at the door? For several agonizing seconds, we didn't move. I could hear my own breathing, shaky and uneven. Then my sister exhaled sharply and pulled the door open. It was our dad. I barely registered what he was saying. The fear hadn't drained from my system yet. My hands were still trembling. He looked at me, confused, then irritated when he saw the state I was in. I wanted to tell him. I really did. But the words stuck in my throat. It felt too stupid to say out loud. He laughed at my reaction, shaking his head as he walked inside. I tried to laugh too, but the sound came out hollow. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself there had been nothing unusual about that woman. That she was just a normal old lady, maybe confused, maybe laughing at something completely unrelated to us. But I couldn't shake the feeling I had while running, that her laugh had moved with me, that it had been chasing me. The next day, I made a decision. I never walked in front of that church again. Even though the back path was dark, quiet, and unnerving in its own way, I chose it every time. Because I knew deep in my gut that I never wanted to find out what would have happened if I had turned around that night. I pulled into the driveway, my tires crunching against the thin layer of ice that had settled on the pavement overnight. The air was sharp, biting at my exposed skin as I sat in the car for a second, watching my breath fog up the windshield. It was just past noon, the winter sun hanging low in the sky, giving everything that dull, grayish-blue hue that made the cold feel even heavier. The driveway looked normal at first glance, but then I noticed the garage door standing wide open. My stomach tightened. That wasn't right. Both my parents should have been at work, and my little brother, Grant, was supposed to be at school. The house was supposed to be empty. I let the car idle for a second, my fingers drumming on the steering wheel as I tried to think. Maybe my dad had just forgotten to close it this morning, but that wasn't like him. He was the type to double-check everything before leaving. And even if he had left it open by accident, why was the house so dark inside? Something felt off. I turned off the engine and stepped out cautiously, my boots crunching against the icy driveway. The cold air filled my lungs as I made my way toward the garage, peering inside. Nothing seemed out of place, just the usual tools on the pegboard, my dad's workbench, the lawnmower parked in the corner. But the emptiness of it, the silence, made my skin prickle. I stepped inside through the garage door, and as soon as I entered the house, I felt it. That feeling, the kind where you know something isn't right, but you can't quite put your finger on why. The house was in disarray. I stopped in the middle of the kitchen, scanning the room. The chairs around the dining table were slightly pulled out, as if someone had been sitting there and left in a hurry. A few cabinets were left ajar, not gaping open, but just enough to be noticeable. Then my eyes landed on something that sent a spike of adrenaline through my chest, Grant's backpack. It was lying on the floor by the entryway. That didn't make sense. If he had come home for lunch or forgotten something, he wouldn't have just left his bag like that. He wasn't the neatest kid in the world, but he wasn't careless either. Then I noticed something even more alarming. Ripley, our family dog, wasn't in her kennel. My pulse quickened. I took a step back, scanning the living room. It wasn't trashed or anything, but something was just wrong. The throw blanket on the couch was bunched up like someone had been sitting there. The remote was on the floor, next to the coffee table. I turned my head toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. Silence. Too much silence. If someone was in the house, they weren't making noise. If Ripley had been let out, she wasn't barking. If Grant was home, he wasn't saying anything. A terrifying thought hit me like a truck. Had someone broken in? Had they taken Grant? Asterisk, asterisk. I felt my whole body go cold. I turned on my heel and sprinted toward my parents' bedroom, my boots thudding heavily against the hardwood floor. My heart was hammering as I ducked into their room, making a beeline for the bed. I dropped to my knees and reached underneath, my hands fumbling for the familiar wooden stock. My fingers wrapped around it. I yanked out my dad's M1.30 carbine, the weight of it grounding me for a second. My breath came in sharp bursts as I reached for the ammunition box beside the bed, my hands shaking as I pulled out a clip and slapped it into place. I stood up, the rifle in my hands, my ears straining for any sound. I forced myself to breathe. Think. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. The house still felt wrong, but I didn't know why. I needed to call my mom. I grabbed my phone out of my pocket and dialed her number with trembling fingers. The phone barely rang before she picked up. "Mom," I said, my voice coming out harsher than I intended. "Ripley is gone. Grant's backpack is on the floor. The house looks like someone went through it. Did Grant get on the bus okay?" There was a brief pause. Then she said something that immediately made my stomach drop. It was a half day today. I just stood there, gripping the rifle, my mind trying to process her words. "He got home early with his buddy Zane," she continued. "They probably just took Ripley for a walk." I didn't say anything. I just exhaled sharply, the adrenaline still buzzing through my veins, my body not fully understanding that there was no danger anymore. My hands felt clammy on the rifle, my pulse still racing as I tried to slow my breathing. "Okay," I finally muttered. "I feel better now." I hung up the phone, taking a moment to let the tension drain from my body. And then, right on cue, the front door opened. The sound made me spin on my heel, my body still riding the last remnants of panic, the rifle still clutched tightly in my hands. There they were. Grant, Zane, Ripley. They stepped inside, their faces still red from the cold. Snow clung to their boots, their breath forming little clouds in the warm house. They were laughing about something, until they saw me, standing in the living room, holding a rifle. The silence stretched. The look on their faces said everything. "What the hell?" their expressions screamed, their eyes flicking from me to the gun to each other. I could feel the heat rising to my face as the sheer absurdity of the situation hit me all at once. I was standing in the middle of the living room, gripping my dad's M1 carbine like I was about to go to war, while my little brother and his friend just walked in from a perfectly normal afternoon. I cleared my throat and quickly, asterisk, asterisk, very quickly, asterisk, asterisk, set the rifle down on the couch. Ripley wagged her tail and trotted over like nothing was wrong, sniffing at my boots. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to find the words to explain myself, but what was there to say? I thought you got kidnapped." Grant blinked. Zane just raised an eyebrow. For a second, nobody moved. And then Grant just shook his head and walked past me, unzipping his jacket. Zane muttered something under his breath that I couldn't quite hear, but I was pretty sure it was something along the lines of, "Dude, what the hell?" I sat down on the couch, exhaling. My pulse was still coming down from the high of it all, my limbs still tingling with the leftover adrenaline. I stared at the rifle for a second before standing up and carrying it back to my parents' room. Carefully, I unloaded it and slid it back under the bed, making sure it was exactly where I found it. When I walked back out, Grant and Zane were already in the kitchen, raiding the fridge like nothing had happened. Ripley plopped down next to the couch with a heavy sigh, her tail thumping once against the floor before she dozed off. The house felt normal again. I sat down, still shaking my head at myself. Yeah, I was never going to live this one down. There are certain memories in my life that I can't explain. Not in a supernatural way, not in some fantasy horror way, but in a way that just doesn't make sense. The kind of memories that sit at the back of your mind, gnawing at you from time to time. Things that happen that don't fit neatly into the way the world is supposed to work. One of the earliest moments like that happened when I was 6. The playground at my elementary school had this huge wooden playset. At least, it felt huge at the time. It had towers, ladders, tunnels, and my favorite part, the bridge. The bridge was about 6 feet off the ground, made of thick wooden planks, and had 2 heavy chains on either side, acting as railings. It was the kind of place where kids would run across, jumping and making the whole thing sway, the chains rattling under their weight. Below the playset was a thick layer of sawdust, meant to cushion falls, though we all knew that if you fell hard enough, it still hurt. That day was like any other. Recess, running, shouting, the usual. I remember being on that bridge, stopping in the middle. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe I was catching my breath. Maybe I was watching my friends. But I remember turning to face the field beyond the playground, looking out at the open space. And then, I was on my back, 15 feet away from the bridge. It was like I had blinked, and in that blink, I was suddenly flat on my back, staring up at the sky. My head throbbed. I could feel sawdust in my hair, in my mouth, scratching at the back of my throat. The impact had knocked the wind out of me, and for a second, I couldn't breathe. Then the faces came into view. My friends, a teacher. They were staring down at me, wide-eyed. I tried to sit up, but my whole body felt like it had just been slammed into the ground. What happened? I managed to get out. One of the kids, a boy I vaguely remember playing with that day, blurted out something that still sticks with me to this day. "You floated." He said it like it was the most natural thing in the world, like he had just seen me jump over a puddle instead of whatever had just happened. Before I could say anything, before I could even process what he had just said, the other kids snapped their heads toward him. Their expressions changed. It wasn't just shock anymore. It was something else. Fear. The teacher grabbed the kid's shoulder and pulled him away from the group, talking to him in a hushed voice. I don't know what she said, but whatever it was, he clammed up fast. I sat there dazed, while my friends helped me up. My knees stung. My elbows ached. It felt like I had fallen, but there was no memory of the fall. Just standing on the bridge, and then nothing. Later that day, I found the same kid, the one who had spoken up. I wanted to ask him what he meant. What had he actually seen? I remember catching him by the swings. He had been playing with some other kids, but when I walked up, he got quiet. His face went pale, like he knew exactly what I was going to ask. I asked anyway. "What did you mean? When you said I floated?" He looked away, shifted uncomfortably. Then, barely above a whisper, he muttered, "You fell." And then he walked off. That was it. No one else talked about it. Not the teacher. Not the other kids. It was like it never happened. But I know it did. The sawdust in my hair. The pain in my back. The way my head spun when I stood up. It all happened. But the actual moment, the fall, the impact, I can't remember any of it. It's just missing. And that's what bothers me. Years later, I had another moment like that. Different place, different time, but the same feeling afterward. That gnawing sense that something wasn't right. I was living in Sri Lanka at the time. My dad worked for the State Department, and we had relocated there for a year. My daily routine included a long bus ride to school, winding through streets lined with small shops and market stalls. I usually zoned out during the ride, just watching the world go by. The traffic in the mornings was always slow, bumper to bumper, which meant plenty of time to take in the sights. One morning, we were crawling through the usual congestion. I leaned against the window, watching as we passed a line of vendors selling everything from fruit to handmade crafts. I remember seeing one stall in particular, a fruit stand, stacked high with oranges. And then I saw the man. He was standing beside the stall, picking up 2 oranges. Nothing unusual about that. But then, he tossed them into the air. And they didn't come down. At first, I thought maybe I was seeing things. Maybe he was juggling, and I had just caught a weird angle where the motion looked off. But no, he had stepped back. His hands were at his sides. And the oranges, they were just there, floating, not moving, not falling, just hanging in the air like someone had paused reality for a second. I blinked, and then we were past the stall. I turned in my seat, trying to get another look, but the bus kept rolling forward, swallowed by the morning traffic. I didn't say anything about it. Not to my classmates. Not to my parents. Because what could I say? That I saw some guy make fruit float? No one would believe me. Hell, I barely believed myself. But I still remember it. Clear as day. Years later, something else happened. This time, I wasn't the one who experienced it directly. But it still unsettles me. It was winter 2008. I had just had surgery for a pilonidal cyst. Painful, but nothing life-threatening. I was home at my parents' house for the break, recovering. My girlfriend, now my wife, stayed over to help take care of me. That first night, we set up in the living room. I was on an air mattress, doped up on pain meds, barely keeping my eyes open. She took the couch next to me. I fell asleep fast. She didn't. Sometime in the middle of the night, she woke up with a jolt. Not because of a sound, not because of anything I had done, just a feeling. She told me later that it was like the air in the room had changed, like something was watching her. She sat up, looked around. The living room was dimly lit from a streetlight outside, but the hallway that led to my parents' bedroom was dark. Then she saw movement. At first, she thought it was just her eyes adjusting. But then, two figures, dark, faintly clouded, passing through the window and moving down the hall. She froze. They stopped at the end of the hallway. One stayed. The other turned toward me. She said she wanted to scream, to wake me up, to do something, but she couldn't move. And then my little sister's voice cut through the silence. She had been standing there the whole time, asking my girlfriend for help getting a glass of milk. My girlfriend jumped up, helped her, and then checked on me. I was burning up, fevered, sweating. I barely remember her shaking me awake. Just the overwhelming pain in my back and the sudden rush to the bathroom to throw up. She didn't sleep after that. And I still wonder, did she just imagine it? A trick of the light? A fever dream brought on by stress? Or was it something else? I don't have the answers. I just know that night, she wasn't the only one awake. It was just another night. Nothing special, nothing out of the ordinary. I was upstairs in my room, sitting on the floor in front of my old PS2, playing Manhunt 2. The dim blue glow of the CRT screen was the only light in the room. My fingers moved automatically on the controller, eyes locked onto the grainy graphics. The air was warm, stale, the kind of heat that lingers in an old house after a long day, even when the sun is long gone. Outside, the world was quiet. Then I heard it. At first, it was distant, just a low rumble in the background. I barely noticed it over the game audio. It sounded like thunder, one of those deep, rolling booms that shakes the sky right before a storm. But it didn't stop. It wasn't one single boom, or even a few spaced-out rumbles. It kept going, growing louder, stronger, like something pressing against the walls of my house, vibrating the floors beneath me. I paused the game, pulled my headphones off, and listened. Boom, boom, boom. The sound wasn't coming from the sky. It was coming from the ground, like a giant heartbeat, a pulse of raw force shaking the earth. It reminded me of a car stereo turned up so loud that it drowns out everything else. But no music, just that deep, continuous pounding. It rattled the glass in the windows, made the walls creak. I sat there, controller limp in my hands, staring at the dark hallway outside my room, waiting for something to happen. The next explosion was so loud that it set off car alarms somewhere down the street. I stood up fast, my chest tightening. Something was wrong. Thunder doesn't come in steady, rhythmic bursts. It doesn't shake the ground in waves. I walked to my window and pulled the blinds up. The street outside looked normal, quiet still, the streetlights casting a dull orange glow. No storm, no wind. The trees in the yard weren't even moving. But the sky wasn't normal. It wasn't dark like a normal night. It wasn't even cloudy. The whole horizon in the distance flickered, glowing faintly orange, like a fire was burning just beyond the edge of the world. The booming continued, rolling through the air in deep, violent bursts. That's when I knew I had to go outside. I left my room, moving quickly down the stairs. The house felt different, off. The way the walls groaned with every explosion, like the wood itself was flinching. I reached the front door and yanked it open. The second I stepped outside, the heat hit me. It wasn't the normal warmth of a summer night. This was different, thicker, like standing too close to an open oven. And the smell, burning. Something was burning, and whatever it was big. The sky to the east pulsed with a red glow. I could see it clearly now, past the rooftops, past the trees lining the neighborhood. It wasn't just the horizon anymore. Huge, flickering flames leapt up into the sky, sometimes vanishing behind a wall of smoke, then bursting out again in violent flashes. The explosions followed, coming in erratic waves, each one sending another pulse of heat through the air. I felt a tightness in my chest. My hands clenched into fists. What the hell was happening? I turned back toward the house, ran inside, and went straight for my mom's room. I didn't even have to knock. She was already awake, standing near the window, staring out with her arms crossed over her chest. My sister was behind her, pale-faced, looking just as confused. Without hesitation, we grabbed our shoes and rushed outside. The street was still mostly empty, but porch lights were flicking on up and down the block. People were stepping out onto their lawns, looking toward the east, whispering. Nobody knew what was happening. Some were standing in their driveways, arms crossed, faces uneasy. Others were pulling out their phones, trying to get a signal or check the news. We didn't wait. We got in the car and took off toward the lake. The roads were eerily quiet. For something this big, something shaking the entire town, you'd expect sirens, flashing lights, maybe even people running in the streets. But there was nothing. Just the sound of tires on pavement, the occasional flicker of a shadow as we passed darkened houses. Then, as we turned the last corner and approached the lake, I saw it clearly for the first time. The town across the water was on fire. Not just a house or two, not even a single block. The entire skyline was glowing, thick black smoke rising in massive columns, flames tearing through buildings, licking at the sky. Behind the trees lining the opposite shore, flashes of orange and red burst upward like bombs detonating one after another. The sound followed a second later, those deep, gut-punching explosions that shook the ground beneath us. It looked like a war zone. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing. The way the fire spread, the rapid bursts of light, the sheer force of the explosions. Nothing about it seemed natural. Were we under attack? That was the only thought in my head. The only explanation that made sense. Some kind of airstrike, a terrorist attack, a gas line explosion. It could have been anything. But the sheer size of it, the way the fire stretched across the entire horizon, made my stomach twist into knots. We weren't the only ones at the lake. A few cars had pulled over, their drivers standing outside, staring in silence. Some had their phones out, recording, but nobody spoke. Nobody moved. We were all frozen, watching the destruction unfold across the water, the wind carrying the thick smell of burning chemicals, of melted plastic and charred wood. Then another explosion erupted, bigger than the others. The shockwave rippled across the lake, sending a hot gust of air through the trees. I flinched, my heart hammering in my chest. My mom muttered something under her breath and turned the car around. We needed to go. The drive back was tense. My mind was spinning with possibilities, trying to piece together what was happening. Was it spreading? Would it reach us? Should we leave town? Should we call someone? But there was no cell signal. Whatever was happening had knocked out the towers. Back home, the house felt different. It wasn't just the distant glow outside the window or the lingering smell of smoke. It was the unease. The feeling of knowing something huge was happening just a few miles away, but having no way to stop it. No way to understand it. The news didn't come until hours later. A propane plant had exploded. The tanks were blowing up one after another, feeding the fire, creating those massive fireballs we had seen from across the lake. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't a war. Just an accident. But that didn't make it any less terrifying. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint echo of distant explosions. Even knowing what it was, the fear didn't go away. I kept picturing the flames, the way they swallowed the trees, the way the sky turned red. I kept hearing that deep, rhythmic booming in my head, feeling the weight of it in my chest. It didn't feel real, but it was. I got off work late, but that wasn't anything new. The closing shift always ran just a little longer than I wanted it to. By the time I walked out of the building, the sun had been down for a while. The air was still warm from the heat of the day, but there was a coolness creeping in that hinted at the coming fall. The end of summer always had this strange feel to it, like the nights got darker faster than they should, like the air carried a kind of quiet that didn't exist in June or July. I adjusted my backpack and started walking. My route home was familiar, and for the most part, it was uneventful. I lived close enough to work that I didn't need a car, but far enough that the walk gave me time to think. It was a routine I'd done countless times before, enough that I barely noticed most of it. Streetlights, sidewalks, the occasional car passing by. It was normal, but there was always one part of the walk I hated. About halfway home, the road curved into an elongated S-shape as it climbed a hill. For some reason, this section was almost completely dark. There were very few streetlights, and the ones that were there didn't seem to do much. The whole stretch of road had an eerie quality to it, even when I told myself it was just my imagination. To my left was a wide, open soccer field, stretching all the way to a school at the far end. To my right was a softball field, its chain-link fence barely visible in the darkness, backed by a dense line of trees. The fields had no lights. At this hour, they were just empty black spaces. I always picked up my pace here. As I walked up the hill, I pulled the metal top from a juice bottle out of my pocket and started clicking it absent-mindedly. It was one of those lids that would make a soft pop if you pressed it down, only to bounce back into place. The repetitive clicking gave my hand something to do, and it was a small distraction from the creeping unease I always felt in this area. Click, click, click. The road started to level out at the top of the first curve. I stopped clicking the bottle top for a moment, and that's when I heard it. A click from the darkness to my right. I froze mid-step. It was faint but clear. Click, click. It had come from the softball field, from the trees. I turned my head sharply, squinting into the blackness. The fence was barely visible, and beyond it, nothing but shadows. I held my breath and listened. Silence. Maybe I had imagined it. I pressed the bottle cap again. Click, click, click. A second later. Click, click, click. This time, there was no mistaking it. The sound was real. It was deliberate. Something, or someone, was clicking back at me. A cold wave of adrenaline rolled through me. I tried to see into the darkness, but it was useless. The trees swallowed everything past the fence. I stood still for a second, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was just some weird echo. Maybe there was an animal moving in the brush, and I was just hearing things wrong. I clicked the cap again, twice. 2 clicks came back. Nope. I turned and walked faster, shoving the bottle cap into my pocket. I didn't want to know what was making the noise. I didn't want to keep testing it. I just wanted to be out of there. As I neared the end of the S-curve, the road started sloping back downward. In the distance, I could see the bright lights of the highway. Almost there. I told myself I was overreacting. It was probably some dumb coincidence. Just my nerves getting the best of me because this part of the walk was already creepy. Then I heard it again. Not from the softball field this time. Across the street. In the trees on the other side. The clicking had moved. I didn't stop walking, but my entire body tensed. I hadn't seen anyone cross the road. I hadn't heard any footsteps. And yet, the sound was there, matching my pace, keeping up with me. I hit the end of the curve and turned left, heading toward the highway. To my left was a tall wooden fence, blocking the backyards of houses I couldn't see. To my right was the 3-lane highway, its streetlights a welcome sight after the darkness of the hill. There were houses on that side too, their windows glowing with the comforting light of people going about their normal lives. I told myself I was fine. I was back in a well-lit area. There were houses all around. If someone had been messing with me, they'd lost their chance now. Then, from the other side of the fence, click, click, click. It was right behind me. I didn't think. I didn't look. I ran. I don't know if I've ever moved that fast in my life. My breath came hard and fast as my feet pounded against the sidewalk. The houses blurred past. My backpack bounced against my shoulders. I told myself I was almost home. Then, from the highway side, a dog started barking, loud and frantic. The kind of barking that makes your stomach drop because it's not playful, it's scared. The barking grew more frenzied, like the dog was working itself into a panic. Then, without warning, a sharp, agonized yelp. Then silence. I nearly tripped as I skidded to a stop, whipping my head toward the highway. The barking had stopped too suddenly, too violently. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. Had something happened to the dog? Had someone hurt it? I stared across the street, heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't see anything unusual. No movement. No sign of what had just happened. Just the houses, the streetlights, the empty road. Then, click, 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 right behind me, right on the other side of the fence. I bolted. I don't remember the rest of the run home. Just the sound of my own breath, the blood pounding in my ears, the overwhelming need to get away. I didn't stop until I reached my front door, fumbling with the lock, nearly dropping my keys in my hurry to get inside. I slammed the door behind me and locked it. I stood there, breathing hard, listening. Nothing. The clicking had stopped. I stood there for what felt like forever, my body still buzzing with adrenaline, waiting for some kind of explanation. But none came. No knocks on the door. No sounds from outside. Eventually, I made myself move. I checked the locks twice before going to my room. I didn't bother taking off my shoes. I just sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor, trying to make sense of it. I never saw anyone. Never found out what or who had been making the sound. The next night, I took a different way home. I was in high school when it happened. The small town I grew up in was the kind of place where people knew each other by name, where gossip spread faster than wildfire, and where history weighed heavy on every street corner. My family owned an old inn, a Georgian-style building dating back to the 1780s. It was beautiful in its own way, with its white-painted brick, tall windows, and deep front porch. The place had been everything over the centuries: an inn, a courthouse, even a makeshift hospital during the Civil War. It had its fair share of history, and not all of it was good. Bar fights had turned deadly. There were stabbings, shootings, and drunken brawls that ended with bodies slumped over tables. Back when it was a courthouse, men had been sentenced to die under that very roof, and the sentence was carried out right outside under the judge elm, a massive, gnarled tree standing at the edge of the lot. They didn't bother with long goodbyes back then. A verdict was given, and within minutes, a noose was swinging from a thick branch. The stories were everywhere. Some people swore they could still hear voices inside the old inn late at night when the place was empty. Others claimed they had seen figures standing by the windows, watching the street below. Some said the air felt different near the judge elm, heavier somehow, like it held onto everything that had happened beneath its branches. I never paid much attention to any of that. I had lived around that building my whole life, and to me, it was just another place. Sure, the floors creaked in the hallways, and sometimes a draft would make a door swing closed on its own, but that was just an old building settling into itself. That was what I told myself, anyway. My parents owned the land the inn sat on, plus the empty lots surrounding it, nearly an entire city block. It was my job to keep the grass cut. I needed money, and they needed the yard taken care of, so it worked out. Every weekend, I'd pull out the old push mower, trim the edges with the weed eater, and sweat through my shirt under the summer sun. That afternoon was no different. I had already finished mowing and was working on the last bit of weed eating near the back of the inn. The thing was old and loud, screaming over the sound of the cicadas in the trees. The air was thick with the smell of fresh-cut grass and gasoline. My arms were starting to ache from holding the machine steady, but I was almost done. Just a few more minutes, and I could call it a day. I wasn't paying much attention to anything else. The weed eater drowned out the world around me. I was just minding my own business, humming along to Michael Jackson's Thriller in my head, when I felt it, a sharp tap on my shoulder. It wasn't a light touch. It wasn't the feeling of a bug landing on me or a stray piece of grass brushing against my skin. It was deliberate, firm, like someone had walked right up behind me and tapped me hard to get my attention. At the exact same moment, I heard a laugh. Not just a chuckle, not something quiet or distant. It was loud. So loud that it cut through the deafening noise of the weed eater. A deep, ugly laugh, the kind that crawled up your spine and made your body react before your brain could catch up. It was right in my ears. For half a second, I didn't react. I wasn't scared yet. I had been expecting some friends to stop by, maybe to mess with me or try to startle me. It had to be one of them. I turned, expecting to see someone standing there, grinning, waiting for me to jump so they could laugh even harder. But there was no one. Nothing. The yard stretched out behind me, wide open, the freshly cut grass leading all the way to the road. There was nowhere to hide. If someone had been standing there, they would have had to run to get out of sight that fast. But there were no footsteps, no sound of anyone moving away. Just the wind rustling the branches of the judge elm. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the empty space where someone should have been. My mind was trying to catch up, trying to explain it. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I had brushed against a branch without realizing it. Maybe the laugh had come from someone down the street, and my ears had played tricks on me. But I knew what I had felt. I knew what I had heard. The weed eater was still running in my hands, vibrating against my grip. I let go of it without even thinking. It hit the ground, still screaming, kicking up bits of grass and dirt as it rattled against the earth. I turned and ran. My legs felt slow, like they weren't working the way they should. My breath was coming too fast, my chest tight. By the time I reached the back door of my house, I was shaking. I yanked it open and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. My heart was pounding against my ribs. I had no idea what had just happened. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of it. It didn't make sense. It wasn't possible. I had been alone out there. No one could have tapped my shoulder. No one could have laughed in my ear like that. And yet it had happened. I stood there for a long time, staring at the floor, listening to the sound of the weed eater still running outside where I had dropped it. My parents weren't home. The house was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning. It felt too quiet. Eventually, I forced myself to go back outside. I didn't want to, but I couldn't just leave the weed eater running out there in the grass. My feet felt heavy as I walked back toward it. My whole body tense like I was expecting something else to happen. But nothing did. The yard was just a yard. The inn was just a building. The Judge Elm stood where it always had, its thick branches casting shadows over the ground. I turned off the weed eater and picked it up. My hands were still shaking. I didn't tell anyone about it. Not at first. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. And maybe I was crazy. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But I never forgot it. Even years later, when I moved away, when the unchanged hands and the stories about it faded, I still remembered standing in that yard with the sun beating down on my back, hearing that laugh in my ears. And sometimes, even now, I think about the Judge Elm. I think about all the things that happened beneath its branches. And I wonder if some things never really leave a place, no matter how much time passes. Maybe it wasn't a ghost. Maybe it wasn't anything supernatural at all. Maybe it was just something old, something tied to that ground, something that had been there long before me and would be there long after I was gone. I don't know. I just know I never went back to mow that yard again. I never put much stock in ghost stories. I grew up in that house, spent years walking its hallways in the dark, never feeling anything close to the fear people associate with the supernatural. Sure, I'd heard the rumors, how some psychic claimed the ghosts feared men, how my mom had her fair share of eerie experiences, but I had never witnessed anything myself. That changed the night my sister moved back in with my mom. At first, it was nothing out of the ordinary. My sister had been away for a while, living on her own, but life had a way of pulling people back home. That night, it was just the two of them, my mom in her room on one side of the house, my sister in hers on the other. It was late, past midnight, when my sister lay in bed with her phone, the glow of the screen the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. The house was quiet, too quiet. There was a shift in the air, a feeling she couldn't quite place, like the moment you step into a room and immediately sense that something is off. She listened. At first, there was nothing but the soft hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Then, so faint she almost thought she imagined it, came the sound of movement. Footsteps? No, more like the subtle creaks and shuffles of someone shifting their weight, trying not to be noticed. She held her breath, her fingers tightening around her phone. The feeling grew stronger, more oppressive. It was as if someone else was inside the house. But no doors had opened. No lights had flicked on. It was just a presence, something in the air that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She told herself it was nothing. She wanted to believe it was just her imagination. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Heart pounding, she eased out of bed. The floor was cool beneath her bare feet as she crept toward the hallway. The house was still dark, the only light coming from the dim glow beneath our mom's bedroom door. Every shadow looked deeper, every corner darker. She strained to hear something, anything, but all she got in return was silence. That's when she made the decision. She needed to wake up Mom. She tiptoed down the hallway, careful not to make a sound, feeling like any noise would draw attention to her. She reached my mom's door, hesitated for a second, then pushed it open just enough to slip inside. My mom had been asleep, but she woke quickly when my sister shook her shoulder. The air felt thick, heavy, pressing down on them both. Even without words, my mom could sense something was wrong. That was just how she was, always perceptive, always tuned into the things no one else noticed. She didn't panic. My mom had lived in that house longer than any of us. She'd seen things she never liked to talk about, but she wasn't about to take chances. She grabbed her phone and quietly pulled up the dial pad, her thumb hovering over the numbers, just in case. Then, with deliberate steps, she made her way to the bedroom door. The house was still shrouded in darkness. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, like unseen eyes lurking just beyond the reach of the shadows. My mom didn't hesitate. She reached for the hallway light switch, took a deep breath, and in a voice that was calm but firm, she made her move. She shouted that they were calling 911 and flicked the switch. The hallway flooded with light. And that's when they saw it. Every single door in the house was open. Not just bedroom doors. Every door. The oven, the microwave, the fridge, the cabinets, the TV stand. Anything that could be opened had been. Doors that had been firmly shut when they went to bed were now wide open, standing there like silent, gaping mouths. My sister's breath caught in her throat. My mom didn't move, her grip tightening around her phone. They stood frozen, their minds racing, trying to piece together what they were looking at. No footsteps. No sounds of someone running or hiding. Just the stillness of the house, now feeling much too large, much too empty. They checked everything. The front door was locked. The back door was locked. The windows were shut. There was no sign of a break-in, no sign that anyone had forced their way inside. And yet, every door had been opened. The more they looked, the worse it got. The TV stand was pulled open, but nothing was missing. The oven door hung open, the inside cold. The microwave door stood ajar, the timer untouched. The kitchen cabinets were all open, their contents neatly in place, untouched, like some invisible force had moved through, opening everything but taking nothing. There was no explanation. The fear set in then, thick and suffocating. My sister's mind raced, trying to find a logical reason. An earthquake, a draft, something, anything, but nothing made sense. My mom, ever the one to stay calm, checked the time on her phone. Just after 2 a.m. They didn't call 911. What would they say? That someone had broken in and done nothing but open doors? That they had felt something there, but seen no one? Instead, they locked the bedroom door, sat on the bed, and waited for morning. The next day, they combed through the house again in the light of day, hoping it would look less unsettling with the sun pouring through the windows. But nothing had changed. No footprints. No sign of forced entry. Just the lingering unease of something that had happened with no explanation. That night, my sister slept with the lights on. Neither of them talked about it much afterward. What could they say? No one else was there. No one had come in or out. Nothing had been taken. There were no answers. The house went back to normal after that. The doors stayed shut. The eerie feeling faded. But something about that night stayed with them. It wasn't just the fact that it happened. It was the way it happened. The silence of it. The precision. The complete lack of evidence. Like whatever had done it didn't need to leave a trace. I still don't know what to make of it. Maybe there's an explanation we just haven't thought of. Maybe there's something about that house we'll never fully understand. All I know is, if you ever find yourself waking up in the middle of the night with the sudden, unshakable feeling that you're not alone, you better hope you're wrong. Because sometimes, the scariest things aren't the ones you can see. They're the ones that leave no trace at all. We moved around a lot when I was growing up. Never far, always within the same town, but enough that it felt like I never stayed in one place for too long. I was about 10 when we moved into the house on Birchwood Drive. It was bigger than the houses we had lived in before, older too, though not old enough to feel historic or anything. Just worn in, like a place that had held other families before us. We were renting it. My parents had divorced, and it was now just me, my mom, my brother, and my new stepdad. The move had been sudden, but I actually liked the house, at least in the beginning. Even now, when I think about it, I don't have bad memories of the place, not exactly. But looking back, I can't ignore the strange things that happened there. The basement was huge, probably the biggest space in the whole house. It was just one big open room, no weird corners or odd layouts, just a plain rectangle of space. It was unfinished but clean, concrete floor, exposed ceiling beams, and cold even in the summer. We turned it into a game room with a dartboard and an old couch, and my brother and I spent a lot of time down there. It was fun, but something about the basement never felt quite right. It was too perfect, too plain, like someone had stripped it down to its bones, but never built anything real on top of it. The walls were smooth, too smooth, as if someone had gone over them with fresh drywall, but never bothered to paint. The acoustics were strange too. If you made a noise, it didn't echo. It just disappeared, swallowed up by the silence. At the far end of the basement, there was a corner with two doors. The first door led to an old bathroom, but it was locked. The owner had kept it that way for reasons we never understood. In the 3 years we lived there, I never saw the inside of that bathroom. The second door was more unsettling. It led to a narrow hallway, which in turn led to the furnace room. The furnace itself was old and loud, roaring to life at random times like some kind of mechanical beast. At the very end of that narrow hallway was another door. A smaller one, thinner than a regular door, with a brass handle that had long since dulled. This door, too, was locked. According to my mom, who had seen it when we first moved in, the room beyond was massive, bigger than our entire basement, and full of old, forgotten things. Boxes, furniture, junk left behind by previous tenants. The owner had kept it sealed, and we never asked why. Within the first few months of living there, we had constant problems with the house's security system and smoke detectors. The owners, an older couple who lived far up north, had installed an expensive whole house alarm system. Anytime a door leading outside was opened, a two-tone chime would sound from small speakers built into every room. The system also doubled as an intercom, meaning that if you were in one room, you could hear noises from the rest of the house. At first, it was just annoying. The smoke detectors would go off randomly, shrieking for minutes at a time before stopping on their own. We tried everything, changing the batteries, resetting the system, but nothing worked. Eventually, my mom called the security company. The man on the other end was confused. He checked the system remotely and told her, hesitantly, that our alarms were supposed to be disconnected. According to his computer, the entire system was inactive, but we could still hear it. Still hear the chimes when a door opened, still hear the shrill beeping of the smoke alarms in the middle of the night. It didn't make sense, but we ignored it. Eventually, the alarms stopped acting up, or maybe we just got used to them. Until one night. It was winter, cold enough that even inside, the air had a bite to it. I was home alone that evening, sitting in the loft above the front door, using the computer. My family had gone out. I don't remember where, but I knew they wouldn't be back for a while. Outside, the world was dark. The kind of deep, endless dark that only comes in the middle of winter. I wasn't paying much attention to the house. I was used to being alone, and I wasn't scared of it. The intercom was right by the desk, and I was only vaguely aware of it until I heard the chime. A door had opened. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The beep was unmistakable. I had heard it enough times to know exactly what it meant. But I hadn't heard the front door open. The sound had come from further away, either the side door or the one leading to the garage. I sat there listening. Then the door closed. Not the heavy slam of the front door. Not the metallic grind of the garage. Just a simple, quiet shut. Then came the footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate. Someone walking down the hallway beneath me, boots thudding against the floor. My first thought was that my stepdad had come home early. But something didn't feel right. The garage hadn't opened. The chime hadn't gone off again. And the footsteps. I don't remember when they stopped. Maybe they did, or maybe I just stopped noticing them. But a few minutes later, when I finally worked up the courage to go downstairs, the house was empty. I checked the locks. Every door was still locked. We moved out of that house when I was 13. It wasn't because of anything that happened, just life. My parents found another place, and we packed up and left. I remember my first night in the new house. I woke up suddenly, disoriented in the dark, unsure of what had woken me. Then I heard it, the chime, that same two-tone beep. I sat up, heart pounding. I heard someone moving around, not in my room, but down the hall. A quiet shuffling, like someone fiddling with something. I told myself it was my mom. I told myself she had gotten up to check on the alarm. In the morning, I asked her about it. She just looked at me, confused. No alarm went off last night. Years later, I found out the truth about that house. I had mentioned it to my mom once, offhandedly, and she went quiet. Then she told me. She had known that house long before we lived there. When she was in high school, she had heard about it. There had been a fire. A boy had died. His name was Andy. He had died of smoke inhalation, in the very room the owner kept locked. I never asked her anything else about it. I didn't want to know, because when I think back to those nights, to the alarms, to the footsteps in the hall, I realize I never did hear that chime go off again after the footsteps started, and I don't think I ever heard the door close. I was lucky that semester. Corner rooms in my dorm building were bigger than the standard ones, and for whatever reason, I didn't get assigned a roommate. Maybe it was a clerical error, or maybe no one else wanted to live in a nearly 100-year-old building with no air conditioning in the middle of North Carolina's brutal August heat. Either way, I didn't complain. Having the room to myself was a privilege, especially in a dorm that was built in the 1920s. The place had character, high ceilings, thick wooden doors, heavy crown molding, but it also had its downsides. The floors creaked, the windows rattled when the wind hit right, and the walls were thin enough that I could hear people coughing in the next room. I kept my 3 windows open at all times to let in what little breeze I could get. Some nights it helped. Most nights it didn't. The heat clung to the room, making it hard to sleep, but I eventually got used to it. I'd sleep in a thin pair of shorts and nothing else, my sheets kicked down to the foot of the bed, waiting for any kind of relief that never really came. It was a quiet dorm. There were parties elsewhere on campus, but our building was mostly for upperclassmen and those who actually cared about sleep. By the time midnight rolled around, everything was still. That night was like any other. I was lying on my back, sweating, listening to my box fan hum in the corner. I don't remember when I fell asleep, but when I woke up, I knew something was off. It wasn't a sudden jolt awake, just a slow awareness creeping in. The fan was still running, its dull drone filling the room, but something else had cut through it. A sound. At first, I thought it was just the blinds. The breeze had picked up a little, and sometimes they'd knock against the window frame. I turned my head slightly, keeping my body still, listening. A pause. Then the noise again. Soft, drawn out. Every 30, maybe 40 seconds. It wasn't the blinds. I watched them carefully, waiting for movement, but they hung perfectly still. The sound wasn't coming from them. I shifted my head toward the other 2 windows. Same thing. No movement. No reason for the sound. Now fully awake, I focused on it. Low, raspy whispering. Almost like words. Shimonese. It was slow, deliberate, stretching out over each syllable. I listened. It came again. Shimonese. The voice was neither loud nor quiet. It wasn't coming from right outside my window, but it wasn't far either. My mind immediately went to the most rational explanation. Someone was outside, whispering up at my room. Maybe a drunk student messing around. Maybe someone from another dorm pulling a prank. I didn't get up right away. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to happen again. Shimonese. 5 times. Maybe 6. The same exact cadence each time, like a recording being played over and over. Then, without warning, the next one was different. It didn't come from the window. It came from inside the room, directly behind my bed. Shimonese. Loud. Harsh. Not whispered anymore. I shot up so fast I nearly tipped over the fan. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I just sat there in the dark, heart hammering, trying to process what I had just heard. The sound had come from inside the room. I turned on the lamp. Nothing. I checked the closet, pushing aside the few clothes I had hanging there. I even crouched down to look under my bed, despite knowing full well it wasn't tall enough for someone to hide under. Nothing. I paced the room for a while, trying to shake the lingering adrenaline. The air was thick with heat, sweat clinging to my back, but I barely noticed. My mind was too busy trying to come up with an explanation that made sense. Maybe I had dreamed the whole thing, but I wasn't the type to have vivid dreams, and even if I did, I had been awake when I heard the whispering. Wide awake. Maybe it had been some kind of weird auditory illusion. Maybe the sound had bounced off the walls, making it seem closer than it really was. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I turned every light on and sat at my desk, facing the entire room. I stayed like that for over an hour, watching, waiting, listening. The sound never came back. I barely slept for the rest of the semester. I kept my lights on every night, the fan running, my door locked. I never told anyone, partly because I wasn't sure they'd believe me, but mostly because I didn't know what I'd be telling them. I looked up the phrase. Shimonese. It didn't match anything. No foreign words, no historical references, no urban legends. Just gibberish. A meaningless string of syllables. It never happened again. I wish I had an answer. I wish I knew who, or what, had whispered outside my window that night. I wish I knew how the last one had come from directly behind me, inside my locked room. But I don't, and I never will. I don't think I'll ever forget that night. No matter how many years go by, no matter how much I try to rationalize it, the memory of that scream still makes my skin crawl. It wasn't just the sound itself, it was the feeling it left behind, the way it twisted in my gut and left something cold and unsettled in my chest. It was late, probably around 1 a.m. My brother and I were sitting in my room, both hunched over the computer, scrolling through some Pokemon forum or maybe reading creepypastas. I don't remember exactly what we were looking at, but I remember how the dim glow of the monitor was the only thing lighting up the room, the way it flickered slightly every time the page refreshed. The house was dead silent except for the occasional clicking of the mouse and the faint hum of the ceiling fan above us. We weren't tired yet. This was normal for us, staying up way too late, whispering about random stuff, trying not to wake our parents. Outside, everything was quiet. The neighborhood was the kind where people turned in early, where the only sounds that ever broke the silence at night were the occasional barking dog or the distant rumble of a passing car on the main road. And then we heard it, a violent shaking noise, like something slamming against wood, followed by a scream so blood-curdling, so gut-wrenchingly raw, that I felt my entire body seize up with fear. It was loud, louder than anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't just a scream of fear or pain. It was something worse than that. It was pure agony. The second it hit my ears, my stomach dropped. My brother and I froze. It wasn't just the sound, it was what came with it, the way the air in the room suddenly felt different, charged with something I couldn't explain. My mind couldn't even process it fast enough. I didn't know if the scream came from a person or an animal, but something about it was just wrong. For a few long seconds, neither of us moved. We just sat there, staring at each other in the pale blue light of the computer screen, our faces reflecting the same look of horror. Then, as if by some unspoken agreement, we bolted. We ran straight to our parents' room, not even thinking. I don't remember opening the door, but I remember the way my mom looked when we burst in pure panic on her face. My dad was awake too, sitting up in bed, his whole posture tense. The shaking sound must have woken them up first, but it was the scream that had thrown them into full-blown alarm. I still didn't know where it had come from, but when my mom rushed to the window, I followed. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the edge of the curtain and peeked out into the street. And that's when we saw her, a young woman, maybe in her 20s, walking slowly down our street. She was wearing a white dress, not fancy, not old-fashioned, just a plain, loose-fitting dress that swayed slightly as she moved. Her hair was long and dark, hanging down past her shoulders. Even from a distance, I could tell she was sobbing, but it wasn't normal crying. Every few seconds, she would let out another one of those horrible screams. Not words, not calls for help, just sheer, inhuman wailing that sent shivers down my spine. It echoed down the empty street, cutting through the quiet like a blade. My dad stood next to us, his face set in a deep frown. I could see the unease in his eyes, the way his shoulders tensed as he watched her move. "Is she hurt?" my mom whispered, but no one answered. For a second, we just stood there, watching. She didn't stumble. She didn't look around. She just kept walking, her pace slow and steady, as if she wasn't even aware of anything around her. The way she moved sent a chill through me. Unnaturally calm except for the gut-wrenching sobs that tore through her chest. My dad made a decision then. Without a word, he grabbed his phone and headed for the door. The second he stepped outside, I felt my stomach twist. I wanted to call out to him, to tell him not to go, but the words wouldn't come. I just watched, frozen in place, as he walked down the driveway and toward the street. He stopped a few feet from her. I couldn't hear what he said, but I saw his mouth move. He was asking if she was okay. She didn't react. She didn't turn to look at him. She didn't slow down. She didn't acknowledge him at all. She just kept walking. For the first time in my life, I saw fear on my dad's face. Not just confusion, not just concern, real fear, He took a step closer and said something again, louder this time. Still, she didn't respond. I could see his hesitation now. He glanced back at the house, then at her. He was trying to decide what to do. And then, just as he opened his mouth again, she let out another scream. This time, it was so loud, so full of raw, broken pain, that I felt tears prick my own eyes just from hearing it. My dad flinched. I saw his body tense, his shoulders stiffen. And then, finally, he backed away. He turned and walked back toward the house, never taking his eyes off of her. When he stepped inside, he locked the door. None of us spoke. The air felt heavy, like something unspoken was hanging over us. My dad didn't try to explain anything. He just picked up his phone and called the police. We stayed up for hours after that. I don't remember when I finally fell asleep, but when I woke up, the first thing I did was check the news, the police reports, anything. Nothing. No reports. No witnesses. No mention of a screaming woman in white wandering through our neighborhood. The police found nothing. No one else had reported seeing her. No one had heard the screams. It was like she had never been there at all. And yet, we had all seen her. We had all heard her. For days after that, I felt on edge. I kept looking out the window at night, waiting to see her again, dreading the possibility that she might come back. But she never did. To this day, I don't know who she was. I don't know if she was hurt, if she was lost, if she was running from something. I don't know if she was even aware of us at all. All I know is that her screams still haunt me. Even now, when the house is quiet and the night is still, I can still hear them in the back of my mind. Asterisk, asterisk, that terrible, broken wailing asterisk, asterisk. I don't know what happened to her, and I don't think I ever will. I was 6 years old when my parents decided to move us out to the country and build a house from the ground up. I didn't have any real say in the matter, but I was excited. The biggest reason? I was finally getting my own room. No more sharing space with my little brother. No more dealing with his messes, his snoring, or his whining whenever he didn't get his way. It was just going to be me, my own bed, my own walls, my own privacy. The house took a while to finish, but when it was done, it was huge compared to where we had lived before. A big one-story house, stretched out long and wide, surrounded by empty fields and patches of trees. There weren't many neighbors, and the closest one was maybe half a mile down the road. We had land, though lots of it. A long driveway led up from the road, and beyond that just open fields. The kind of place where, at night, it was dark. No streetlights, no cars passing by, just the sound of wind through the trees and the occasional cry of coyotes in the distance. Inside, the house was bright and clean. My bedroom was near the front, across the hall from my brother's. We shared a bathroom in between, but to get into it, we had to leave our rooms and go through a single door in the hallway. It was kind of annoying, especially at night when I had to get up to pee, but it wasn't a big deal. At first, I loved having my own space. But after a while, I started noticing things. I was maybe 8 or 9 when I started getting this weird feeling in my room at night. Like I wasn't alone. Like something was watching me. It wasn't every night, but often enough that it stuck with me. Sometimes I would wake up suddenly, my heart pounding, feeling like something had just moved in my room. Other times I'd be lying there in bed, staring at my open door, convinced that if I looked away, something would be standing there when I looked back. I told myself I was just being a kid, that I was scaring myself over nothing. But then came the day I saw her. It was in the middle of the afternoon. Bright daylight, nothing spooky about it. I had been playing in my room, and my dirty clothes were piled up near the wall by my door, something my mom always got onto me about. I was bending over, grabbing some shirts to take to the laundry, when I saw something in my peripheral vision. A shape, an old woman, dressed in all white, moving fast past my door. So fast that I barely caught a glimpse of her before the bathroom door slammed shut. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. My entire body locked up, heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my ears. I was home alone. I hadn't heard anyone come in. I hadn't seen anything before that moment. For maybe a full minute, I just stood there, staring at the bathroom door. Then, slowly, I forced myself to move. Step by step, I crept toward the door. I didn't want to open it, but I had to. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and pushed it open. Nothing. The bathroom was empty. No sign that anyone had ever been in there. I backed away, shut my bedroom door, and sat on my bed, my hands gripping my knees. I told myself I imagined it. That maybe a draft from the AC had slammed the door. That maybe I had just thought I saw something. But the feeling stayed with me. Years passed. The feeling never really went away, but I learned to ignore it. I grew up, went to high school, got a job, started spending less and less time at home. I never really talked about what I had seen that day. What would I even say? I saw an old woman run into my bathroom. People would think I was crazy. Then years later, a buddy of mine came to stay with me for a few days. He had driven down 3 hours to hang out, and we spent most of the time gaming in my room. That night, around midnight, He paused the game and said he had to take a leak. I barely even noticed him leaving the room. I just sat there, waiting for him to come back, eyes on the screen. Then I heard him scream. Not just a yell, not a startled noise, a full-on, blood-curdling scream. Before I could even react, I heard him running. His footsteps pounded down the hallway, and suddenly he was back in my room, grabbing his stuff, shoving it into his bag. His face was pale, his hands shaking. I asked him what happened, over and over again. He didn't answer. He just walked straight out to his car, threw his bag inside, and drove 3 hours home in the middle of the night. I texted him. He didn't reply. I called him. He didn't answer. A week later, he finally told me. He had been washing his hands in that same bathroom. He looked down to grab some soap. And when he looked up, there was another face in the mirror. Watching him, he never came back to my house again. I thought that was the worst of it. But the scariest moment of my life had nothing to do with that house. It happened when I was in high school, working as an assistant manager at a restaurant. I had a lot of cute female coworkers, but there was one girl in particular, Sue. She was funny, smart, beautiful. We got along great. I had a crush on her, but I never worked up the nerve to ask her out. We all had our routines at work. When people left for the night, I'd usually say something simple. Later. See ya. Nothing special. But the night before she died, I said something different. I don't know why. She was leaving, walking out the door, and I made eye contact with her. Something about that moment felt off, like time slowed down for just a second. And instead of my usual goodbye, I said, "Goodbye, Sue." The next day, an EF4 tornado hit. She was killed. It messed with me for a long time. Why did I say those words? Why did I get that weird feeling right before? It felt like some part of me knew. I still think about it sometimes. About that house. About that bathroom. About Sue. I don't believe in ghosts. Not really. But I know what I saw. And I know what happened. I don't know why we did it. Maybe boredom, maybe morbid curiosity, maybe just the kind of stupidity that comes with being young. My friend and I had this thing where we drive around at night, looking for places to freak ourselves out. Abandoned roads, deep wooded areas, places where the darkness felt thicker. It was a stupid habit, but it gave us a rush. And back then, that was enough. I grew up in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, 5 minutes from the old Picton farm. If you know the name, you know why that place is infamous. A serial killer's hunting ground. A place where dozens of women vanished. He'd been in prison for years by then, but the farm still stood, empty and rotting. The kind of place that felt like it had soaked up too much horror to ever feel normal again. You could see it from the road, the way it just sat there untouched, like a scar the city refused to heal. That night, my friend and I decided to drive past it. We'd done it before, but never that late. It was almost 2 a.m., the streets dead, the world asleep. We had nothing better to do, and we were in the mood to scare ourselves. So we took the long, quiet road that ran past the property, our headlights cutting through the thick black. The first thing I noticed was the gravel. Huge piles of it, maybe 10 or 15 feet high, sitting just beyond the fence. Just sitting there, as if someone had started a project and never finished. And then, perched on top of one of the gravel piles, was a chair. It wasn't just any chair. It was small, one of those little school chairs meant for kindergarten kids. Way too small to be useful to anyone out there in the middle of nowhere. I remember staring at it as we rolled past, my brain trying to make sense of it. There was no reason for a chair like that to be sitting up there. No houses close enough for it to belong to. No construction site. Just this eerie little chair, placed so carefully on top of the gravel, like it was meant to be there. It gave me an uneasy feeling, but I didn't say anything. We reached the end of the road and turned around. My friend was driving, and as we came back the way we came, we slowed down to look at the chair again. Just one more look, just to make sure we weren't imagining things. That's when I saw it. In the rearview mirror, movement. I turned my head, and my stomach dropped. A truck. A massive truck, its headlights off, creeping up behind us. I don't know how long it had been following us. I don't know where it came from. But it was there now, right on our bumper, close enough that if my friend tapped the brakes, it would have slammed straight into us. For a second, I was frozen, just staring at it, my mind struggling to process what I was looking at. The truck was so close that I couldn't even see its grille, just the dark, hulking shape of it, barely an inch from our car. Then the fear hit. I managed to force out a noise, some kind of garbled warning, and my friend must have sensed the panic in my voice because she slammed on the gas. The tires squealed, and we shot forward. The truck shot forward too. It stayed right on us, matching our speed, never backing off. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was trying to break out of my chest. I kept my eyes on the mirror, watching as this massive shadow kept pace with us, never letting up. It wasn't just following us. It was chasing us. We were flying down the road, pushing the car faster than we should have, but it didn't matter. The truck stayed right there, inches away, like it was waiting for us to make a mistake. The road was a straight shot, but we were coming up on an intersection. If we turned left, we'd be heading toward home. If we turned right, we'd be heading deeper into the industrial area. Nothing but empty lots and warehouses. We hit the intersection, and my friend jerked the wheel left. The truck turned right. Just like that, it was gone. No hesitation, no slowing down. It just veered off into the darkness, disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared. We didn't stop driving. We didn't talk. We just kept going, putting as much distance between us and that place as possible. It wasn't until we pulled into my driveway, shaking and out of breath, that we let ourselves process what had just happened. I told my brother about it, half expecting him to laugh at us for getting spooked. But he didn't. He just gave me this weird look and said, "You know, Picton's brother still lives around there, right?" I didn't know that. I still don't know who was in that truck that night. Maybe it was just some random asshole messing with us. Maybe it was someone with worse intentions. Or maybe, just maybe, it was someone who didn't like us poking around that place. I try not to think about it too much. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder what would have happened if we had turned right instead of left. I grew up in Central California, a place that, by most accounts, wasn't particularly exciting. It wasn't small-town rural, but it wasn't a major city either, just a normal town with neighborhoods, strip malls, and farmland on the outskirts. The most remarkable thing about it, at least at the time, was its location. We sat right in the middle of 3 massive air bases, the kind of place where military activity wasn't uncommon, but it also wasn't something most people paid attention to. Fighter jets cut across the sky now and then, sonic booms rattled windows on rare occasions, but that was just background noise. In early 2003, everything changed. In the months leading up to the invasion of Iraq, the town took on an uneasy energy. Nobody said it outright, but you could feel it, the tension in the air, the way people looked up more often, how they noticed things they wouldn't normally care about. It wasn't paranoia, exactly, but it was close. Military helicopters, Apache gunships, I think, became an almost daily sight. They moved in pairs or small groups, low and deliberate, cutting across the sky like predatory birds. Even at night, you could sometimes hear them passing over, the distant whump-whump of their blades carrying through the cool air. I didn't know why there was suddenly so much activity, but everyone seemed to take it as a given that something was coming. I still don't know if what happened next had anything to do with the military presence, but it was the only explanation I ever came up with. It was midday when the sky changed. My dad and I had gone downtown for something. I don't remember what exactly, just that it was a normal, errand-running kind of day. The sky was cloudless, and the air had that crisp, dry quality that only comes in early spring before summer heat settles in. I wasn't looking for anything unusual when I saw it. I was just looking down at my own shadow, absent-mindedly kicking at the pavement, when I noticed that everything had a strange greenish tint. Not a reflection, not a trick of my eyes. Everything around me had shifted slightly, like I was looking at the world through a dirty glass bottle. I frowned, blinking, trying to shake the effect, but it stayed. Then the sky erupted in light. It was blinding, pure, searing white, as though someone had detonated a flashbang in the sky. I instinctively raised an arm, squinting against the intensity, but it was like trying to stare directly into the sun. The brightness washed everything out, turning buildings into shapeless masses, the street into an empty void. Just as quickly, darkness swallowed the light. For an instant, it was like dusk, not full night, but unnervingly dim, the kind of murky half-light that comes before a storm. My eyes struggled to adjust, my brain lagging behind what was happening. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything snapped back to normal. I lowered my arm, blinking rapidly, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The street was the same. The buildings were the same. The people, though, something was different. Across the sidewalk, a woman was crouched low, her hands braced on her knees, eyes wide with shock. A man a few steps away had his arms up like he'd been shielding himself from an explosion. A group near a crosswalk had broken into a sprint, ducking behind a parked car. Everyone had seen it, and yet, when it was over, no one spoke. People straightened, adjusted their coats, glanced around as if waiting for someone else to react first. But no one did. Slowly, awkwardly, they just resumed whatever they had been doing. I looked up, expecting to see something, an aircraft, a flare, something, but the sky was empty. There was no smoke, no lingering afterimage, nothing at all to suggest that the world had just, for a few terrifying moments, come undone. The memory of that flash lingered with me for days, a weight in the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. It wasn't the kind of thing you could forget. I tried to find explanations, but there were none. No news reports, no mentions on the radio, nothing. People acted like it had never happened, or maybe they just convinced themselves it was a trick of the light, some atmospheric anomaly that wasn't worth worrying about. I didn't believe that. A week or so later, something else happened. Something even stranger. It was late afternoon, the sun just starting to dip, painting the sky in warm hues. I had stepped outside to grab something from the car when I heard it, a distant metallic-sounding whine, like a jet engine but off, too sharp and too hollow at the same time. It was coming from above. I looked up and saw the object. It wasn't a plane. It wasn't a helicopter. It was a massive, torpedo-shaped metal body with stubby wings, screaming low over my house. My breath caught in my throat. It was moving fast, faster than anything I'd ever seen at that altitude, but it was low enough that I could see details. Words and numbers printed on the side, too far to read, but clear enough to make out. It was roughly the size of a small car, sleek and unnatural in a way I couldn't quite describe. Then, in an instant, it was gone. I stood frozen, heart hammering. I had no idea what I had just seen, but I knew one thing. It wasn't normal. Months passed. The war began. The nightly news was filled with images of missiles streaking into Baghdad, tracer rounds carving through the darkness. Even though it was happening thousands of miles away, it cast a shadow over everything. People were on edge, but life went on. That summer, my grandparents took my brother and me on a trip to Los Angeles. On the way back, we were driving through the grapevine late at night, somewhere between 10 and 11 p.m., when we saw it. At first, it was just a light, a bright pinprick in the sky, too low to be a star, too distant to be an aircraft. It hung there, motionless, growing brighter by the second. Then it expanded. The light swelled, turning into a massive, pulsating orb. It flickered, shimmered, taking on an unnatural green hue that bled into the surrounding darkness. The foothills below were bathed in its glow, casting long, unnatural shadows that stretched across the landscape. Then, from its center, an explosion of brilliant green light. A shockwave rippled outward, followed by a second, pearlescent ring that expanded even faster, radiating out like the rings of a dying star. The highway came alive. Cars pulled to the shoulder, doors flying open as people stumbled out, heads tilted back in shock. Some stood frozen, others pointed, some took off running, as if there was anywhere to go. It was panic, raw and unfiltered, because in that moment, none of us knew what we were looking at. For all we knew, it was the end. The fireball lingered, burning against the night sky, too massive, too unnatural to be anything explainable. Minutes passed, then an hour. It didn't fade, didn't dissipate, just hung there, pulsing like a slow, dying heartbeat. Eventually, people got back in their cars. The world kept moving. I never found an explanation. Years later, I learned that there was a base nearby that occasionally tested missiles, and maybe asterisk, that's what we saw. But even knowing that, it never quite added up. The sheer scale of it, the unnatural way it lingered, the raw, unshakable feeling that something was wrong. I don't know what any of it meant. I only know that, for a brief stretch of time, the world felt different. And I haven't stopped watching the sky since. I don't think I really believed in ghosts back then. I mean, I liked scary stories as much as the next person, but I never thought any of it was real. At most, I figured some weird things happened in the world, but they all had explanations. And if they didn't, well, we just never found them yet. That changed the night I broke out my grandmother's old Ouija board. I was 16. It was a Saturday night in February, one of those cold, dull winter weekends when there wasn't much to do. I'd invited my best friend, Amber, over for a sleepover at my place. We'd done this 100 times before: movies, snacks, stupid gossip about people at school, maybe some prank calls if we got bored enough. But this time, for some reason, I decided to dig through the old junk in my grandmother's attic. My grandmother had passed away years ago, and since my mom never got around to clearing out most of her things, there was still a ton of old furniture and dusty boxes stacked up in that attic untouched. I don't know what made me start poking around up there that afternoon. Maybe I was just restless. Maybe I was just looking for something interesting. Either way, that's how I found it, the Ouija board. It was in one of those worn-out cardboard boxes, stuffed between yellowed newspapers and brittle, forgotten books. The board itself was old, much older than the ones you'd see in a store. The edges were worn smooth, and the letters were faded like it had been used a lot over the years. The wooden planchette was in the box with it, nestled in a mess of crumpled tissue paper. It smelled like old books and dust, the kind of scent that clings to things left sitting in the dark for too long. I didn't think much of it at the time. I just thought it was cool. I grabbed it and brought it down, figuring Amber and I could mess around with it later. Then came the part one regret. We'd already planned for another girl to come over. Her name was Sophie. She wasn't really a friend, not exactly. More like a mutual acquaintance, someone we'd known since elementary school, but never fully clicked with. We'd invited her out of obligation. She'd overheard Amber and me making plans and kind of invited herself, and we weren't rude enough to tell her no. She was easy to mess with, though. Easily scared, easily flustered. That was probably why, when I brought out the Ouija board and set it up on the living room floor, Amber and I got a little too into messing with her. We dimmed the lights, set the board between us, resting it on the thick carpet. Sophie was already reluctant, but Amber and I were laughing, playing it up, acting like we were summoning something dark and horrible. We started sliding the planchette around on the board, spelling out nonsense, pretending like something was answering us. Sophie's face got paler with every letter. It was harmless fun. At least, that's what I thought. It was about an hour in when we finally started to slow down. Sophie had gotten so nervous she wasn't even playing along anymore. She was just sitting there, looking uncomfortable, arms wrapped around her knees. Amber must have started to feel a little bad because she pulled out her bag of candy from the corner store and started sorting through it. I remember exactly what she had: gummy worms, peanut butter cups, and one of those little sealed packages of sweethearts, those pastel-colored candy hearts with messages stamped onto them. We'd only bought them because it was close to Valentine's Day and they were on sale. None of us even really liked them that much. Amber started peeling open the bag, shaking some of the candies into her hand. That was when I noticed Sophie really wasn't okay. She wasn't just spooked, she was shaken, gripping her knees so tightly her knuckles were white. I rolled my eyes, half annoyed at how seriously she was taking it. If a spirit was really here, I said, mostly just to prove a point, it would make its presence known to us. Not even 3 seconds later, Amber fumbled her bag of candy hearts. The package ripped open, and half the candies spilled out onto the board. We all froze. The room was quiet except for the faint rustling of the plastic wrapper as Amber slowly pulled it back. We looked down at the board, and that was when I saw them. 2 of the hearts had landed directly in the middle of the board. One was pink, one was yellow. Both of them had the exact same words printed on them. Ready, Amber? I remember the feeling that crawled up my spine in that moment. Like something cold had seeped under my skin, coiling around my ribs. My stomach turned. Amber's face had drained of color. She was staring at the board, mouth slightly open, the candy package still clutched in her fingers. She hadn't moved since she dropped them. I couldn't look away from those words. Asterisk, ready, Amber? Asterisk. The messages on those candies were always random. We knew that. They had dozens of different phrases, things like be mine, love you, call me, hug me. We'd never seen one that said ready, Amber before. Sophie shot up from the floor, so fast it startled me. I'm done, she said. Her voice was shaking. I'm done. I'm not playing anymore. She stormed out of the room before either of us could respond. I don't know how long Amber and I sat there after that. The room felt heavier, like the air had thickened around us. Neither of us wanted to touch the board. I finally forced myself to pick up the candies, rolling them between my fingers like I'd find some kind of explanation if I looked hard enough. I didn't. That night, we shoved the Ouija board back in its box and put it in the back of my closet. We never touched it again. Over the next few weeks, Amber and I kept trying to brush it off. It was just a coincidence, just a weird fluke. But some part of us must not have believed it, because we started buying sweethearts constantly, tearing through package after package, checking each one for anything similar. Nothing. Hundreds of candies, every possible phrase we could think of, asterisk text me, miss you, kiss me, asterisk. But not Ready Amber, not once. It wasn't until years later that I realized how impossible that moment had been. The odds of even one heart saying Ready Amber were unbelievably slim. The odds of two of them landing perfectly on the board like that, it still makes my skin crawl to think about it. I kept the hearts for a long time. At first, it was to prove to myself that it had really happened. Then, over time, it just became something I held on to without knowing why. They've worn down now. Years of being kept in a little box, moved from drawer to drawer, have rubbed away the ink. The letters are faint, almost invisible. If I showed them to someone today, they'd probably just look like two old blank candies. But I know what they said. I know what I saw. And I still don't have an answer for it. I was around 10 or 11 when this happened. Looking back on it now, I still get that same sick feeling in my stomach whenever I think about it. It's not like I was some kid afraid of the dark or scared of being home alone. No, I was used to that. But that night, I learned that sometimes, the things that scare you the most aren't monsters from a story or ghosts in the hallway. Sometimes it's real. And real is much worse. At the time, my mom worked at a dental clinic about an hour away. My dad would pick her up every night, which meant he was gone for about 2 hours. During that time, it was just me and my older sister at home. She was a teenager, which meant she mostly kept to herself. I didn't mind. We weren't the kind of siblings who bickered much. We just did our own thing. That night, I was downstairs eating. It was sometime around 8. I don't remember exactly what I was having, but I remember sitting at the dining table, the TV playing quietly in the background, the house silent except for the occasional creaks and the low hum of the refrigerator. It was one of those nights where everything felt still. Too still. I finished eating and got up to go upstairs. The layout of our house was simple. The stairs led up to the second floor, but right beside them, there was a room that connected to the garage and basement. That room always creeped me out. It was always colder than the rest of the house, and it had this stale smell, like old wood and dust. I never liked passing by it at night, but I never had a reason to be afraid. Until that night. As I started walking up the stairs, something made my skin crawl. A feeling, like something was there. I wasn't even at the top yet when I heard it. A deep voice, coming from somewhere behind me. Well, hello. It wasn't just deep. It was wrong. It sounded too low, too rough, like it was scraping against something. It had a weight to it, something unnatural. Not unnatural like a ghost. Unnatural like a person whose voice had been worn down by years of smoking, by alcohol, by things I didn't even want to think about. It sounded close. Too close. I didn't think. I just ran. My legs nearly gave out as I scrambled up the stairs. I don't even remember touching the steps. I stumbled into the living room, breathing so hard it felt like my chest was about to cave in. My sister was sitting on the couch, completely unaware of what had just happened. I didn't even bother explaining. I just dropped to the floor behind the couch and curled up, trying to breathe, trying to understand. It wasn't my imagination. I know what I heard. For a moment, I stayed there listening. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that felt forced, like something was holding its breath. I wanted to believe I had imagined it, but I knew I hadn't. Then another thought hit me. The basement. I had never really thought about it before, but our basement had a small window. It was one of those short, rectangular ones near the ceiling, meant for ventilation more than anything else. It was old, the lock barely worked, and most of the time, it was just left shut, but not properly secured. If someone had gotten in, I didn't want to finish the thought. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly messed up the numbers. The operator answered, and I gave them our address, my voice barely coming out. They told me to stay on the line, and that officers were on their way. The wait felt like forever. I kept expecting to hear footsteps, the creak of the basement door opening something. But nothing happened. I kept my eyes on the hallway leading to the basement door, half expecting someone to step out. When the police finally arrived, they knocked on the door loudly. I jumped and nearly dropped the phone. My sister opened the door while I stayed frozen in place. The officers came in, asked us a few questions, then went to check the house. They went to the basement first, and that's when they found them. Smashed beer bottles. Some of them were fresh, still dripping, shards of glass scattered across the concrete floor. The officers shined their flashlights around, scanning every corner. And then they noticed the window. It was open, wide enough for someone to fit through. My stomach twisted. Whoever had spoken to me, whoever had been inside our house, had been in our basement drinking. Maybe they'd been hiding there for hours, maybe even longer. I didn't want to think about it. The officers searched the area outside, and that's when they found the tracks. Footprints leading away from the house, disappearing into the trees behind our neighborhood. The next day, my parents had every window in the house secured with locks. They were shaken, but relieved nothing worse had happened. A week later, we found out who it was. A homeless man. He had been breaking into houses, not to steal valuables, but to find alcohol. He would go into basements, garages, anywhere people stored liquor. He didn't care about money. He only wanted one thing. And that night, for whatever reason, he had decided to speak to me. He was arrested a few days later, caught breaking into another house. I never heard his voice again, but I still remember it. I still remember the way it sounded. Too deep, too close, too real. And worst of all, I still remember the way I felt when I heard it, because that's the part that never really goes away. This summer, my friend called me up out of nowhere and said, "Let's go hiking." It wasn't something I had planned, but where I live, there are plenty of mountains, trails, and places to get away from everything. I didn't have anything better to do, so I agreed. We got another friend to join us, making it a trio, and the next morning we set off. The first 2 days went smoothly. The friend who had suggested the trip was the most experienced among us. He had hiked countless trails, knew how to navigate without a map, and could read the land like a second language. He wasn't reckless, but he had a habit of pushing limits, always wanting to take the harder path. My other friend and I weren't as experienced, but we trusted his judgment. He was the kind of person who made you feel like you were in good hands, like he knew exactly what he was doing at all times. The weather was perfect, clear skies, no wind, and the heat was just enough to keep us comfortable without making the climb miserable. We had packed light but smart, tents, sleeping bags, enough food to last us, and plenty of water. The terrain was varied, shifting between dense tree cover and open rocky areas. We moved at a good pace, taking short breaks when we needed them. On the morning of the third day, we reached a familiar point in the trail. My more experienced friend and I had been here before. Ahead of us was a sharp incline, a natural wall of rock leading up to the next part of the mountain. We knew there was an easier route. If we took the valley to the left, we could gradually ascend to the same point with far less effort. But my friend, confident as ever, suggested we go straight up. "We've done this before," he reminded me. I hesitated. The last time we were here, we had gone the easier way. We had never climbed straight up the rock face. But I wasn't the kind of person to argue against someone who knew more than me about this stuff. My other friend didn't object either. So, without thinking too much about it, I followed. At first, it wasn't bad. The incline started off gradual, and the rock had enough ledges and footholds that it didn't feel dangerous. We used our hands to steady ourselves, gripping at cracks in the stone, but it was nothing we couldn't handle. The higher we climbed, though, the steeper it got. The ground below us started falling away at an alarming angle. One wrong step, and we'd be tumbling backward onto jagged rocks. Then we hit the section that would later earn its name, the Mother King Huge Drop ***. We didn't realize how bad it was until we were right in front of it. The rock face in front of us was nearly vertical, at least a 70-degree incline. It was only about 8 feet tall, but it felt impossible without ropes or gear. There were barely any handholds, just tiny crevices where you could fit 2 fingers at best. If you lost your grip, there was nothing to stop you from falling. My experienced friend went first. He climbed like it was nothing, moving with the kind of confidence that made you believe it was easier than it looked. He reached the top in seconds, standing up there like it was no big deal. My other friend went next. He struggled a little more, moving slower, double-checking each hold before committing to the next step. When he reached the top, our friend gave him a hand and helped pull him up the last stretch. Then it was my turn. I knew I was the weakest climber of the group. I wasn't out of shape, but I didn't have the upper body strength for something like this. But at that moment, standing at the base of the rock face with my friends waiting for me at the top, I felt like I had no choice. I wasn't about to be the one who backed out. I reached up, slipping my fingers into one of the tiny cracks in the rock. My grip felt weak. My fingers barely had enough room to hold on, and the stone felt smoother than I expected. I tried to ignore the growing sense of doubt in my mind and pulled myself up. I made it about halfway before my arms started shaking. My legs scrambled for footing, and my left foot found a small ledge, but it felt loose. I kept climbing anyway. I was too focused on making it to the top to worry about anything else. Then my foot slipped. In an instant, both my feet were gone from beneath me. My fingers strained against the rock, barely holding on, but the panic made me lose control. My grip gave out. I fell. Everything happened in a blur. I didn't even have time to think before I felt two sets of hands grab my arms. My backpack jerked back as one of my friends got hold of the strap. My body swung forward, feet kicking uselessly against the rock, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst. They held on. I dangled there for what felt like forever, my mind blank with panic. I didn't even try to climb. I was too stunned. My arms burned, my fingers useless, but my friends weren't letting go. They pulled. I don't know how, but they managed to drag me up. My body scraped against the rock, my legs scrambling for any kind of support. Finally, I was over the edge. I collapsed onto solid ground, gasping for air, heart racing. No one spoke. I just lay there, staring up at the sky, trying to process what had just happened. My entire body was shaking, adrenaline flooding my system. I couldn't believe how close I had come to falling. If my friends hadn't reacted in time, I would have been gone. At best, I would have broken something. At worst, I didn't even want to think about it. For the rest of the hike, I couldn't shake the feeling of what could have happened. I replayed the moment over and over in my head, thinking about how my feet had slipped, how my hands had failed me, how the fall had felt inevitable. By the time we made it back home, the story had already taken on a life of its own. We joked about it, laughed about how I had nearly died, and gave the climb its now infamous name, the motherfucking huge drop. But deep down, I knew it wasn't funny. It was real. And if things had gone just a little differently, I wouldn't be here to tell the story. I was about 14 when this happened. It was late at night, and everything in the house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards as the temperature dropped. Outside, the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the slight breeze, a steady and soft background noise that had always been comforting. Our house had a small front yard, bordered by a wire mesh fence that separated us from the neighbor's property. It wasn't the most secure barrier, but it did the job of keeping the garden enclosed while still allowing us to see into the neighbor's yard. They had a dog, a shaggy, not-so-bright little thing named Priscilla. She wasn't the smartest, but she was friendly, always trotting up to the fence to greet me when I walked past. Sometimes, though, she barked in the middle of the night. It was never anything serious, usually just a cat passing by or some movement in the bushes that got her riled up. I'd grown used to it over the years. That night, I was in the living room with my mom. The curtains were drawn, and the only light came from a small lamp beside the couch. The rest of the house was dark. It was late, probably around midnight, and we were about to head upstairs when Priscilla started barking. Not just one or two barks, but a sharp, repetitive barking that had a little more urgency to it than usual. My mom paused, listening. "Should we check outside?" she asked. I shrugged. Nah, she's probably barking at a cat. It wasn't unusual, and we were tired, so we turned off the light and went upstairs to bed. I didn't think about it again until the next morning. The next day started like any other. I got up, ate breakfast, and went about my usual routine. It wasn't until later that I overheard my mom talking to the neighbor's housekeeper. She had stopped by, as she sometimes did, to chat for a few minutes. I wasn't paying attention at first, but then I caught something in her voice, something that made me pause. "I saw him," she said, "last night when Priscilla was barking. That got my attention." I looked up, my mind suddenly replaying the events of the night before. She continued, lowering her voice slightly, as if speaking too loudly would somehow bring the moment back to life. I looked outside to see what she was barking at, and there was a man standing right outside your window. The words made my stomach drop. He saw me, she added. And he did this. She raised her hand and mimicked emotion across her throat. A slow, deliberate gesture. A chill ran down my spine. If you scream, I will kill you. That's what he had silently threatened. I couldn't move for a moment. I just stood there, letting the weight of it settle in my chest. He had been there, right outside the window. The same window I had stood in front of the night before, speaking casually to my mom. I had been inches away from him, with nothing but a thin pane of glass separating us. I hadn't even thought to look outside. I had just assumed it was a cat, like always. But it hadn't been a cat. I kept replaying it in my head, trying to make sense of it. Why had he been there? Had he been watching us for a while? Was it just a random chance that he had come to our house? Or had he been waiting for an opportunity? The worst part was that I hadn't noticed anything. No strange noises, no feeling of being watched, nothing. The house had felt just as safe and normal as it always did. And yet, right outside, just beyond the curtain, someone had been standing in the darkness, watching. I started to wonder how long he had been there. Had he been watching the house earlier in the night? Did he know we were awake, or had he expected the house to be empty? The thought of it made my skin crawl. From that day on, I couldn't stop checking the windows. Every night, before turning off the lights, I would pull the curtain aside just enough to peek out, scanning the yard, the fence, the garden, looking for anything, any movement, any shape in the shadows. I told myself it was just a one-time thing, a random event, but that didn't stop me from feeling uneasy, because the truth was, I didn't know if it was random. I didn't know if he had been watching before. I didn't know if he would come back, and that was the worst part, not knowing. For weeks after, I felt different in my own home. The place that had always felt safe now had an edge to it, like there was something lurking just beyond sight. Every noise at night made my heart jump. Every time Priscilla barked, I froze, wondering if he was out there again. I kept thinking about that moment, about how I had been standing at the window, completely unaware. I had spoken so casually, so carelessly, right in front of him, and he had been standing there, watching, listening. I thought about what would have happened if I had looked outside, if my eyes had met his through the glass. Would he have run? Or would he have stayed? Would he have tried the door? Would I have frozen in fear, unable to move? I hated that I would never know, but part of me was glad I hadn't looked, because I didn't want to see his face. I didn't want to know what it looked like, because once you see something like that, you can't unsee it, and I think it would have haunted me even more. Eventually, the fear faded. The sharp edge of it dulled with time. I stopped feeling like I had to check the windows every night, though I still did it sometimes out of habit. Priscilla kept barking at cats. Life moved on, but every once in a while, when the house was quiet and the lights were off, I would remember that night. I would remember how easily I had dismissed it, how close I had been to him, and how, if things had gone just a little differently, I might not have been so lucky. I was 12 when I had a sleepover at my friend Hannah's house. It was one of those nights that should have been uneventful, the kind you barely remember years later, just another weekend spent at a friend's place. But something about that night never sat right with me, and even now, I can't explain it in a way that makes sense. Hannah and I had been friends since we were little, close enough that sleeping over at each other's houses was routine. Her family lived in an older, two-story house in a quiet neighborhood. It had a lived-in feel, well-worn couches, mismatched furniture, and little signs of life everywhere. Hannah's mom worked night shifts at a hospital, so most of the time, it was just her dad, and her little brother at home. That weekend, her dad and brother were away visiting relatives, which meant it was just the two of us in the house. I didn't think much of it at the time. The biggest thing on my mind that night was the kittens. Hannah's cat had just given birth to 4 tiny fur balls, and they were at that stage where they had just started walking, still clumsy, still small enough to fit in your hands. Hannah was obsessed with them, and for most of the evening, that's all we did, play with the kittens, letting them climb up our arms, watching them wrestle with each other. At some point, we got tired. We had been watching movies in her room, the kind of movies we weren't really supposed to watch, horror stuff that made us nervous about turning the lights off, but that we'd never admit to being scared of. The kittens had worn themselves out, too, curled up in a pile in Hannah's lap, tiny bodies rising and falling with sleep. Hannah fell asleep pretty quickly. I wasn't as lucky. The kittens weren't done with me. They must have sensed that I was still awake because one by one, they started crawling all over me. Little claws dug into my blanket, tiny paws pressing against my legs, chest, and arms. They were relentless, climbing over my face, batting at my hair. I kept shifting, trying to get comfortable, but they just saw it as an invitation to play more. It was funny at first, then annoying, then exhausting. At some point, I must have drifted off despite them, half asleep but still aware of their tiny movements. The room was dark, the only light coming from the glow of Hannah's nightlight, a small plug-in one by the wall. That's when I felt it. A shift. Not a big one. Just the sense that someone else was in the room. I was too tired to open my eyes at first. I heard the soft sound of movement, the barely there sound of someone stepping carefully, like they were trying not to wake us. Then, one by one, the weight of the kittens disappeared. They weren't climbing on me anymore, weren't nudging at my arms or my face. Someone was picking them up. I thought it was Hannah's mom. Eyes still closed, I turned my head slightly. The words came out automatically. "Thanks." And for just a second, I saw her. She was standing near the door, holding the kittens in her arms. She wasn't looking at me, just calmly cradling them as she turned away. She was tall, lanky, long dark hair hanging straight down her back. Then she was gone. The door never creaked, never clicked shut. But suddenly, the room was still. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was too tired, too out of it to process anything beyond the fact that the kittens were finally off me. I let my eyes close again and drifted back into sleep. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of breakfast. Hannah was already up, sitting at the edge of the bed, scrolling through her phone. The kittens were back, curled up in a little nest of blankets by the window. It was bright outside, sunlight streaming through the curtains. I stretched, blinking the sleep away. The memory of last night came back in bits and pieces, mostly the kittens, their tiny claws, the exhaustion. And the woman. I sat up. "Your mom took the kittens off me last night." Hannah barely looked up. "What?" I yawned, rubbing my face. I woke up and felt someone taking them off me. I saw her standing by the door. She had long dark hair. That got her attention. She frowned, lowering her phone. "My mom's blonde." I blinked. "Yeah, I know. I guess I was just half asleep. Maybe I imagined it. It made sense at the time. I hadn't gotten a good look, just a quick, groggy glimpse. My brain must have filled in the blanks wrong. Still, something felt weird about it. We got up, heading to the kitchen, and that's when I saw her. Hannah's mom was standing at the counter, pouring coffee. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes. She had just come home from work. She wasn't even in the house last night. That stopped me in my tracks. I felt a weird, slow crawling sensation up my spine. Hannah's mom must have noticed, because she looked over at me. "You okay?" I swallowed. "Yeah, but I wasn't." I thought back to last night, trying to remember every detail. The way the woman moved, the way she held the kittens, how quiet she was. I tried to make it make sense. Maybe I dreamed it. Maybe Hannah got up, and I just thought she was taller in the dark. Maybe I was still groggy and imagined the whole thing. Maybe. But I knew what I saw, and I never slept over at Hannah's house again. I was alone at home, studying for my university exams in my bedroom upstairs. It was late afternoon, but in winter, that didn't mean much. The sun had already set, and outside, the rain drummed steadily against the windows, muffling the sounds of the world beyond. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Dad was at work. Mom and my sister were out watching a play, which meant they wouldn't be back for hours. The house, normally filled with the usual hum of people moving, talking, watching TV, or making dinner, felt lifeless. The kind of silence that makes you notice how empty the space around you is. I had my earphones in, music playing just loud enough to block out distractions, but not so loud that I wouldn't hear my phone buzz or someone knock on my door. My desk lamp cast a dim pool of light over my notes, the pages filled with scribbled equations and half-memorized definitions. I had been at it for hours, my eyes starting to blur from the strain of studying. Our house backed onto a dense stretch of bushland, a mix of trees, undergrowth, and rough, uneven terrain that stretched out behind our fence for miles. It wasn't a park or a designated reserve, just wild land, overgrown and ignored. If someone really wanted to, they could push through the thick brush and find themselves in our backyard. It wouldn't be easy, but it wasn't impossible either. I had thought about that before, usually in passing. A vague, unsettling thought that lingered in the back of my mind, but never felt like a real concern. At least, not until that night. The music had just ended. For a brief moment, the house settled into absolute silence. And in that gap, I heard it. A dull thump, then another. A rhythmic, deliberate sound. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, unmistakable. I froze, my mind immediately snapping into focus. The rain outside made it hard to judge distance, but the sound was close, inside the house, downstairs. The weight of each step was wrong. Too heavy. I knew the way my mother walked, the way my sister hurried through the house, the way my father's steps carried up the stairs when he came home in the evenings. These weren't theirs. These were different. Work boots. Thick, muddy work boots pressing against the hardwood floor, dragging small flecks of wet debris with them. The kind of boots that shouldn't be in our house. The kind that belonged to someone who had no reason to be here. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I stayed completely still, straining to hear more. The footsteps didn't move at first, but then thump, 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 asterisk. They were real, and they were coming from inside my house. I pushed back from my desk so fast my chair scraped against the floor. The sound made me wince. I stood, my knees locked, listening for any sign that the person had heard me. Nothing, just the rain against the roof. I stepped toward the bedroom door, easing it open with careful hands. The upstairs hallway was dark, the only light coming from my room. I moved as quietly as I could, walking toward the top of the stairs, every step feeling like it took an eternity. The air felt wrong. The house suddenly felt too big, the shadows deeper, the silence heavier. I gripped the banister, peering down. The living room was dim, lit only by the glow of the small lamp near the couch. From my angle, I couldn't see much, just the edges of furniture, the closed front door, the dark kitchen beyond. But I could hear it, the sound of someone breathing. Low, controlled, but definitely there. The footsteps had stopped, but I knew that someone was standing just out of sight. I swallowed hard, forcing down the panic rising in my chest. My hands felt cold, but my skin was burning. My thoughts raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Could it be my dad? No, he was supposed to be at work. My mom and sister? No chance. A stranger. Someone had gotten into the house. And I was alone. I had no weapon, no way to defend myself. Just my own body, my voice, and the hope that whoever was downstairs wasn't looking for trouble. My brain screamed at me to stay silent, to back away and hide, but I couldn't. I had to do something. My voice came out deeper than normal, forced, shaky but loud. Asterisk, go away. There is someone here. Asterisk. The house swallowed the words, the silence after them feeling even heavier than before. Then nothing. No response. The breathing had stopped. The footsteps had stopped. But the presence was still there. I knew it. I took a step forward, fists clenched, my body locked in fight or flight mode. The stairs creaked under my weight. If they hadn't known where I was before, they did now. A shape emerged from the shadows near the back door. A figure, drenched from head to toe, standing just at the edge of the dim light. For a brief, terrifying moment, I thought I was looking at a complete stranger. And then I saw his face. It was my dad. For a long second, I couldn't move. The fear had built up so much that my body didn't know how to shut it off. He stood there, soaked from the rain, his work boots dripping mud onto the floor. He hadn't come in through the front door. He had come from the backyard, through the bush, through the darkness, through the same overgrown stretch of land I had spent years imagining faceless strangers creeping through. I exhaled sharply, my legs finally unlocking as I took a step forward, the adrenaline still shaking my limbs. My dad looked at me, confusion on his face, but I didn't care. I just hugged him. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He just stood there for a moment, still dripping wet, before patting my back with one heavy, muddy hand. The fear slowly drained out of me, leaving exhaustion in its place. I pulled away, shaking my head, not sure whether to laugh or yell at him for scaring the life out of me. Instead, I just walked past him, grabbed a towel from the hallway closet, and tossed it at him. He caught it without a word. I didn't ask why he had come home early, why he had decided to cut through the reserve instead of using the driveway, why he hadn't answered me when I shouted. None of that mattered now. What mattered was that I wasn't alone in the house anymore. Later, when my mom and sister came home, I told them what had happened. My sister laughed. My mom rolled her eyes. My dad shrugged it off like it was nothing. They teased me for it, called me paranoid, said I was too security conscious. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I knew one thing for certain. That fear I felt, that heart-stopping, ice-in-my-veins fear, it had been real, and it had been justified. Because that night, for those few terrifying minutes, I had been alone in the house with someone I didn't recognize, and I had no way of knowing how it was going to end. I was 20 years old, working as a chairlift operator at Beaver Creek Resort in Colorado. It wasn't exactly the most exciting job, but it paid the bills, and the setting was beautiful. The mountains stretched out in all directions, covered in thick layers of white powder, the air always crisp, always smelling faintly of pine and cold. I lived with a couple of friends from high school, one of whom also worked at the resort. We weren't raking in money, but we had a decent little setup, just a small rental house a few miles from the slopes. Enough space for the three of us to crash after long shifts in the cold. It was mid-season, and work was the same as always. Standing out in the snow, making sure tourists got on the lifts without falling flat on their faces, and counting the hours until we could clock out and do something more interesting. That particular afternoon, I was in the middle of my shift when my roommate called. Not on my cell, he called the house phone. I remember thinking it was odd because we rarely used it unless one of our phones was dead. The second I heard his voice, I knew something was wrong. He wasn't one to beat around the bush. Kevin died. Those two words just hung there. I didn't understand them at first. Kevin? Our Kevin? One of our best friends? The guy we had spent almost every summer with playing dumb pranks and wasting hours on the same old back roads? There weren't any details, just that Kevin had been found dead back in our hometown in the Midwest. He had been hanged from a tree in a park. That was all we knew. No explanation, no context. Just that he was gone. My first thought was that it had to be a mistake. Someone was mixed up, or it was some awful prank. But my roommate's voice was dead serious, and the moment I heard the way he said it, I knew it was real. We didn't even talk about it much. There wasn't anything to say. We both just knew we had to get back. Work didn't matter. Sleep didn't matter. We packed our things, called out of our shifts, and hit the road. The drive back was a blur. A long, exhausting stretch of highway, the kind that melts into itself after too many hours. It was winter, so the roads were a mix of wet and icy, the sky a constant dull gray. We took turns driving, stopping only when we had to. I don't remember us talking much. Every now and then, one of us would say something about Kevin, some story from high school, some dumb thing he had done, but it never lasted long. It didn't feel real yet. By the time we rolled into town, it was late at night. We didn't go home first. Instead, we went straight to Dan's place. Dan had been Kevin's roommate, and if anyone had details about what had happened, it would be him. When we got there, the place was packed with our old friends. Some I hadn't seen in years, others I had kept in touch with. The energy in the room was strange, not quite awake, not quite a gathering. Everyone was just there, stuck in that place between sadness and disbelief. Dan told us everything he knew, which wasn't much. Kevin had been found hanging from a tree in the park, no clear signs of what led up to it. The police didn't have any immediate answers. There was no note, no obvious reason for it. He had been seen earlier that day, just going about life as usual. Nothing seemed off. No one knew if it had been suicide or something else. The whole thing didn't sit right with me. Kevin had always been the kind of guy who lived to mess with people. He was the biggest prankster I had ever known. He had a way of making you feel like you were losing your mind, always setting up elaborate jokes, always one step ahead. He wasn't the type to just end things like that. It was around 1 a.m, and I was standing in the kitchen with a few friends, still trying to wrap my head around it all. The air was heavy with cigarette smoke, the counters covered in half-empty beer bottles. I wasn't drinking. I couldn't. My head was too messed up. Then my phone rang. I pulled it out of my pocket, glanced at the screen, and felt my stomach drop. Kevin. It was Kevin's number. For a second, I couldn't move. My breath caught in my throat, and my fingers went numb. My friends saw the caller ID too. I remember the look on their faces, wide-eyed, silent. No one said anything. We all just stared at my phone like it was some kind of bomb about to go off. I hesitated but answered. Silence. Not static, not breathing, just nothing. I said his name. Nothing. I listened for any sound at all. Still nothing. Then the call ended. I put my phone down, my hands shaking. My friends tried to come up with explanations. Maybe someone had stolen his phone. Maybe it was some kind of glitch. But none of it made sense. Kevin had been dead for days. His phone should have been with his family or the police. I didn't sleep that night. The next evening, I was at my parents' house. The funeral was the next day, and I figured I might as well do some laundry while I was home. Their basement had always been creepy, one of those unfinished ones with exposed pipes, cracked concrete floors, and dim lighting that always seemed too dim. The pull-string light was the only way to turn it on, which always made it feel like you were stepping into some horror movie. I was down there alone, switching clothes from the washer to the dryer, still lost in my own head. I wasn't thinking about the call. I wasn't thinking about ghosts or anything weird. I was just thinking about Kevin, about all the dumb things we had done, all the times he had pulled pranks on me. I reached up and pulled the string. Click. The light went out. The basement was pitch black. Before I could even move, I heard it. A whisper, inches from my ear. "You can't see me now." My entire body locked up. The words weren't just familiar. It was Kevin's voice. Not like his voice. It was his voice. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. A few seconds? A few minutes? My brain refused to work. Every hair on my body stood up. My skin went ice cold. Then, finally, I ran. I didn't even turn the light back on. I bolted up the stairs, 2 at a time, nearly tripping over myself. I burst into the living room, shaking, breathless, trying to explain to my mom what had just happened. She didn't know what to say. I didn't either. I didn't go back down to the basement. I barely slept that night. The funeral was rough, but nothing else happened. No more weird calls, no more voices. To this day, I don't know what to make of it. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in anything supernatural. But I know what I heard. I know it was Kevin's voice. And I know he loved messing with me. Maybe that was it. Maybe somehow, someway, he had one last prank left in him. One final joke. And if it was, well, he got me good. I never liked that apartment. It always felt off, like something in the air wasn't right. Maybe it was the neighborhood, the kind of place where people minded their own business, not because they were polite, but because it was safer that way. You didn't ask questions. You didn't get involved. You just lived your life, kept your doors locked, and hoped nothing ever forced you to deal with the people lurking outside. My wife and I had moved in because rent was cheap, and at our age, we didn't need much. Just a place to sleep, a small kitchen, and enough space to live out the years without too much hassle. The apartment complex was nothing special, just a row of aging one-story units with stained beige walls and old screen doors that rattled in the wind. The kind of place where the paint peeled a little more every year, where the people who moved in rarely stayed for long. We had a small front porch, just big enough for a plastic table and 2 chairs, though we never really used them. The street out front was quiet during the day, with only the occasional car rolling by, but at night it changed. The wrong kind of people came out. People who wandered aimlessly, people who lingered on corners, people who weren't up to anything good. I had learned early on that it was better to ignore what happened outside. A shouting match in the parking lot? Not my business. A car rolling through slow with its headlights off? Not my problem. A couple of guys standing under the street lamp, passing something between them? I just turned the other way. It was easier to pretend I didn't notice. And for a while, nothing happened. But then there was the night with the man at the door. It was around 3 in the morning when the sound woke me. A loud, insistent banging on the screen door. Not a polite knock, not the hesitant tap of a neighbor needing help. This was forceful, aggressive, someone hitting the metal frame over and over. I stayed still in bed, listening. My wife stirred beside me, but neither of us moved. The banging continued, a steady rhythm that made my chest tighten. Then it stopped. I waited, holding my breath. The room was silent, except for the distant hum of a passing car on the highway. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps on the porch. Slow, pacing. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see the faint glow of the streetlight through the curtains. A shadow moved across it. Someone was still out there. We didn't call the police. Maybe we should have, but we were old, and after years of living in rough places, you just stopped reacting to things the way other people might. Cops wouldn't do anything anyway. By the time they arrived, whoever it was would be gone. It wasn't worth the trouble. Still, I needed to know who was out there. Carefully, I shifted out of bed, keeping my steps light as I moved toward the window. The curtains were thin, just enough to block the inside from view, but not enough to completely block the outside. I peered through a tiny gap. There he was, a bald man, standing just outside the door, smoking a cigarette. I couldn't see his face clearly, just the faint glow of the burning ember as he inhaled, the orange light briefly illuminating his features before fading again. He didn't look around. He didn't seem nervous. He just stood there, like he had every right to be on my porch at this hour. I watched as he exhaled a slow cloud of smoke, then flicked the cigarette onto the concrete. It sparked as it hit the ground. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the streetlight's glow. I stayed at the window for a long time after that, listening, waiting for the sound of footsteps to return. But they never did. Eventually, I went back to bed. In the morning, I almost convinced myself it had been nothing. Just some drunk who wandered onto the wrong porch. Someone looking for a friend's place. Someone who didn't know where he was. Then I stepped outside. The first thing I noticed was the cigarette, but the filter stained with spit, lying near the front step. But it wasn't just that. On the plastic table beside the chair, there was a knife. A big one, the kind you'd use in a kitchen, but not just for cooking. This was the kind of knife that could do real damage. The blade was long, the handle worn, like it had been used plenty of times before. I stared at it, a sick feeling curling in my stomach. There was no doubt in my mind where it had come from. He left it there. Why? Was it a message? A warning? Did he leave it by accident? None of it made sense. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It was heavier than I expected. I thought about throwing it away, but something stopped me. Instead, I brought it inside and placed it on the counter. Neither of us talked much about it, but we both knew. That was the moment we decided we couldn't stay. It wasn't just the knife, it was everything. The feeling in the air. The way the street seemed different at night. The knowledge that someone had stood outside our door for who knows how long, knocking, pacing, leaving behind something sharp and deadly without a word. Within a month, we packed up and left. We never found out who he was or why he was there. We never saw him again. But I still think about that night sometimes. About how close he was. About what might have happened if I had opened the door. I never believed in ghosts. I still don't. But something happened to me a couple of years ago, and to this day, I can't fully explain it. It was early December, just after my ex-wife had left for deployment. We had moved into this house a few months prior, a rental in a quiet neighborhood, nothing fancy but big enough for the two of us. She always talked about strange things she felt, shadows in the hallway, the sensation of being watched, doors shifting when no one was near them. I brushed it off as her imagination. I wasn't the type to believe in that kind of thing. But after we moved into this house, I started noticing things too. At first, it was small. Footsteps when I knew I was alone. The occasional door moving slightly, just enough to catch my attention, but never enough to convince me it wasn't just airflow. Sometimes at night, I'd hear loud bangs, like someone had run full speed into a counter, or a door, or a wall. The kind of sound that makes you expect to hear a crash follow, something falling or breaking. But nothing ever was. I always had an explanation. Houses settle, with expands and contracts with temperature changes. Maybe a neighbor slammed a door, and it carried through the walls. There was always a way to rationalize it. But once my ex-wife left, everything escalated. Maybe it was just that I was alone and paying more attention. Maybe I'd started getting in my own head about it. But the house felt different. The air inside was heavier. The silence in the evenings felt thicker. The usual sounds of the house, pipes groaning, the fridge clicking on, started making me jump. More than once, I found doors open that I swore I had closed. One night, I set my phone on the kitchen counter, walked away for a minute, and came back to find it on the floor across the room. I tried to recreate how it could have fallen, but nothing made sense. Then came the night everything changed. It was cold outside, but I had stepped onto the back porch for a cigarette, like I did most nights. It was a habit. Go outside, light up, stand there staring at nothing for a few minutes, then go back inside. I always locked the door behind me as a force of habit, checking the handle as I slid it shut. That night was no different. I locked it, then unlocked it again, just so I wouldn't have to fumble with it while holding my cigarette. I turned on the porch light and stepped outside. The yard was dead silent, just the usual hum of distant traffic and the occasional rustling of dry leaves. I took a slow drag and let the cold air settle in my lungs. Then the porch light clicked off. I stood there for a second, frozen. I had flipped the switch myself just moments ago. The light wasn't on a timer, and there was no wind, no flicker, just a clean, deliberate click. I turned back toward the door. The interior of the house was pitch black. I pressed my face against the glass, peering inside. Nothing. No movement, no sign that anyone was there. I reached for the handle and pulled. Locked. A tight, solid lock. The same lock I had just undone before stepping outside. My stomach dropped. I pressed my hand against the glass, straining my eyes into the dark. The layout of the kitchen was familiar. The countertops, the dining table, the chairs all in their usual spots. But the house felt different. Like the moment I stepped outside, it had changed into something else. Something that no longer belonged to me. I didn't want to stand there waiting to find out if something was in there with me. I hurried around the side of the house, my breath fogging in the cold air. My bedroom window was just high enough to be a problem, but I had left it cracked earlier that evening for fresh air. I reached up and pushed against the frame. It slid open. I hesitated. Something about climbing through that window made my skin crawl. Maybe it was just the idea of coming inside blind, dropping into my own bedroom like a burglar. Or maybe it was the fact that, for the first time in my life, I truly wasn't sure what I was walking into. I forced myself through, landing awkwardly on the carpet. I stayed still for a second, crouched low, listening. The room was silent. I reached under the mattress and grabbed the hatchet I kept there. Not because I expected to use it, but because my body demanded some kind of defense. I stepped out into the hallway. The house felt wrong. I knew every creak of these floors, every faint hum of the appliances, the way the air moved when the heater kicked on. But standing there in the dark, hatchet in hand, I could have sworn I was in a different house altogether. I moved slowly, checking each room. Nothing was out of place. The doors were all closed except for the ones I knew I had left open. Nothing missing, no signs of forced entry, no footprints on the carpet. When I reached the sliding door, I stopped. The lock was still in place. The same lock I had checked before going outside. I stood there staring at it, my breath coming in slow, controlled exhales. I knew I had unlocked it. I knew I had left the door slightly open. I reached out and turned the lock. It clicked smoothly, the same way it always had. The door slid open effortlessly. The cold night air drifted in. I took a step outside and looked around, my eyes scanning the yard, the fence, the alley beyond it. Nothing. I checked every window, every door. Everything was locked. Everything was secure. I didn't sleep that night. For the next few days, the house felt different. The usual creaks and bangs had stopped. No more doors shifting on their own. No more distant footsteps in the hall. It was like the house had been waiting for something, and now it had gotten its answer. Eventually, I stopped thinking about it. Time passed, life went on. My ex-wife returned, and though I never told her what happened that night, she made a comment about how the house felt quieter than before. I still don't believe in ghosts, but I do believe in the feeling of being watched, of doors locking on their own, of a house that waits. I was 14 when my parents decided we were moving into the old house, a turn-of-the-century place that looked more like a rundown castle than a home. I hated it from the start. We had been living with my grandparents before that, and I loved it there. Their house was warm, familiar, full of good food and good memories. But things weren't easy for my family back then, and moving was necessary, even if I wanted nothing to do with it. The new house was abandoned when my parents bought it. Not the charming kind of abandoned, where people might picture dust-covered furniture waiting for someone to come home, but the sad kind. The kind where the walls had water stains, the floors had soft spots, and the air smelled like damp wood and something else. Something old. It took a full year of work before it was livable. Every weekend, we'd drive out as a family. My parents would rip out rotten floorboards or scrape peeling wallpaper, while my brother and I were left to entertain ourselves. It was easy to feel uneasy in that house. I tried not to buy into the stories. The classmates who told me it was haunted. The rumors that people had seen lights flicker inside while it was still abandoned. My brother swears to this day that he saw something once. A shape in the hallway. A figure that vanished when he looked straight at it. But I've never believed in ghosts. Even as a kid, I didn't want to believe. Most of it, I figured, was puberty. That weird stage of life when everything feels just a little off, a little wrong. Maybe it was the stress of moving. Maybe it was my resentment toward the place. Maybe it was just the house settling, the old wood shifting in its frame. That's what I told myself, anyway. But there was one thing that happened. Something I've never been able to explain. It was one of those long summer days when my parents were working on the house. The place still wasn't finished, so we weren't living there yet, just visiting, fixing it up, making slow progress. I was sitting outside on a little side porch we never really used. It was small, maybe 15 feet across, and sat about 4 feet off the ground. Just a simple wooden platform with a railing. Technically, it overlooked the road, but it wasn't a great view. The front porch, about 20 feet away, was bigger and covered, so we mostly used that instead. That afternoon, I had my BB gun with me, planning to shoot at the starlings. I wasn't really aiming at anything. Mostly, I was just killing time, trying to make the day go faster. My brother was nearby, maybe 15 feet away, picking wild blueberries from the patch near the house. He was only 7 then, still small, still in that phase where nothing seemed to bother him for long. The sun was out, hot, beating down on the porch boards. The air smelled like dirt and dry grass, like the heat itself had a weight to it. Then I heard it, clear as day. A voice. "Hey you, can you see me?" Hey, just like that. Direct. No echo, no distortion. Like someone was standing right there, talking to me. I froze. I looked around. There was nobody there. Nobody anywhere. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. But then my brother spoke up, not looking away from the blueberries. "Did you hear that?" My stomach dropped. If he heard it, then it wasn't in my head. He just kept picking berries, like it wasn't anything. Like it was just some passing sound, like a bird call or the wind through the trees. But I knew it wasn't. I stood up slowly, scanning the area. There was nothing but open land. The road was empty. No cars. No people. Just the field stretching out beyond the house, the trees lining the edge of the property. It was too close. The voice had been too clear. Too real. For a long time, I just stood there waiting, listening. But nothing else happened. After a while, I sat back down. My brother kept picking blueberries. We never talked about it again. At the time, I tried to brush it off. Just a weird moment. A trick of sound. Maybe someone shouting from farther away, their voice carrying on the wind. But here's the thing. The more I think about it, the less sense it makes. Because the way that voice sounded, it was right next to me. Close enough that it should have had a source. A shape. A person standing there. But there was nothing. And I knew it. And the way it spoke. Not a yell. Not a question thrown out into the air. It was directed. Purposeful. Like someone was trying to get my attention. But I couldn't see them. I still don't believe in ghosts. I've searched for them. I've put myself in places people say are haunted, waiting, watching. And nothing's ever happened. But I've never been able to explain that voice. Even now, years later, it lingers in the back of my mind. That summer day, the empty porch, the way my brother just went on picking blueberries like nothing had happened. Like it was normal. Like it was nothing at all. I must have been about 5, maybe 6 years old. It's hard to say for sure, but I remember how small I felt, how wide the world seemed back then. My parents owned some property in a quiet town, just a couple of acres of land that felt like an endless wilderness to a kid my age. There weren't many houses around, just patches of open fields, dense tree lines, and an old gravel road that stretched beyond where I was allowed to go alone. We used to camp there sometimes, just my family and me, away from everything. The nights were different out there, darker, deeper. The kind of dark that wrapped around you, thick and absolute, where even the shadows seemed swallowed up. But the stars, God, the stars. I still think about them sometimes, how bright and endless they looked. The kind of sky that made you feel small in the best way possible. That night, I was alone in the open field, lying flat on my back in the grass. The air smelled fresh, a mix of dirt, dry grass, and that faint scent of pine from the trees lining the edges of our property. There was no wind, just the stillness of a summer night, broken only by the occasional chirp of crickets and the distant croak of a frog from somewhere near the woods. I had wandered a little farther than usual, but it didn't matter much. This was our land, and I never felt afraid out here. I don't know how long I laid there, staring up, getting lost in the endless spread of stars. It felt like forever. Just me and the universe, nothing else. I remember following the constellations with my eyes, tracing patterns in the sky, trying to pick out the brightest ones. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a bright spot, one single light, far off in the distance. I didn't think much of it. Maybe a plane, I told myself. Planes flew over sometimes, though not often. But as I kept watching, I realized something was different. It wasn't blinking, just one steady, bright glow. And it was getting bigger. I sat up, frowning. It didn't move like a plane. It was coming toward me, fast. My heart started to pick up, but I didn't move. I just stared as the light grew, shifting from a small speck in the sky to something much larger. Then I saw the others. There were 6 of them, all lined up in a perfect row, evenly spaced apart, moving together in complete silence. Their glow wasn't harsh like a spotlight, but strong, steady, and unnatural. They were close now, close enough that I could see just how massive they were. Whatever it was, it had to be huge, at least 100 feet across, maybe more. I scrambled to my feet, my breath caught somewhere in my throat. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A plane? No. A helicopter? Impossible. They weren't making a sound. Not even the distant hum of an engine. Just silence. I tilted my head back as they passed directly above me, no more than 200 or 300 feet overhead. My body was frozen, my legs locked in place as I craned my neck to follow their movement. The lights stretched across the sky, a perfect formation. I should have heard something. Anything. But there was nothing. Just the quiet hum of the night, as if the world itself had gone still in their presence. Then they were gone. I blinked, turning quickly, expecting to see them trailing away behind me, but the sky was empty. Completely empty. The stars were still there, scattered across the dark expanse, but the lights had vanished. No streaks, no fading glow. Just gone. I stood there, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My skin felt cold, my hands clammy despite the warm air. I kept turning, searching the sky, waiting for them to reappear, but there was nothing. Just the same endless stars as before, as if nothing had happened. For a long time, I didn't move. I just stood there, staring at the place where they should have been, trying to convince myself I hadn't imagined it. But I knew what I saw. I knew it was real. Eventually, I forced myself to move, taking slow, shaky steps back toward the tent where my parents were sleeping. My legs felt weak, unsteady, like I'd been running even though I hadn't moved an inch while it happened. I didn't wake them. I don't know why. Maybe because I didn't want to say it out loud. Maybe because some part of me already knew they wouldn't believe me. I crawled into my sleeping bag, pulling it tight around me, staring at the fabric walls of the tent, wide awake. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those lights again, those perfect, silent lights. I didn't sleep that night. Even now, all these years later, I still don't know what I saw. A plane, a drone, some kind of military craft? None of it makes sense. Planes make noise. Drones back then weren't that big. And if it was military, why here? In the middle of nowhere? I've looked up similar stories, read about sightings, but nothing ever quite matches what I saw. Nothing explains the silence, the way they moved, the way they just disappeared without a trace. I still think about it sometimes. On clear nights, when the stars are out, I catch myself staring at the sky waiting, wondering, but they never came back. I never believed in anything beyond what I could see, touch, or prove. The world was solid, logical, and predictable, or at least I thought it was until that night. It was 2008. My mom, my brother, and I were visiting my grandparents. We had traveled a long way, and by the time we arrived, the exhaustion of the journey had set in. The first day was perfect, simple, peaceful, full of good food and warm conversations. My grandparents' house was old but comforting, filled with familiar smells of home-cooked meals and the faint scent of wood that had aged over decades. We spent the entire day with them, catching up, eating together, and sharing stories. By the time the sun set, I was feeling a deep, quiet contentment. It had been a long day, and since we had a train back home early the next morning, we all decided to sleep early. I had no idea that this night was about to change me forever. I remember waking up suddenly. My eyes snapped open, and for a second, I had no idea why. Everything was still. The house was completely silent, the kind of deep quiet that only settles in the dead of night. I was lying beside my mom, the soft glow of the streetlight outside filtering through the curtains, casting faint patterns on the walls. Then I heard it, a crow's caw. It was sharp, loud, and sudden, so out of place that it sent a chill down my spine. Crows don't call at night. I knew that much. But before I could fully process it, something moved in the kitchen. A dark shape. I blinked. A crow. It was flying inside the kitchen, its wings flapping in the dim light. My heart pounded. How the hell did a crow get inside? The windows must have been left open. That was the only logical explanation. I sat up, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. The hallway leading to the kitchen was dark, but the weak light from outside gave just enough visibility. As I stepped inside, I felt the cold floor against my bare feet grounding me. The kitchen was empty. No bird. No open windows. Just silence. I checked everything, even running my hand along the window frames to make sure they were locked. My mind struggled to make sense of it. Had I imagined it? Maybe I was still half asleep. Shaking my head, I walked back to my bed, feeling strangely unsettled. My mom was still lying beside me, undisturbed. I exhaled slowly and forced myself to close my eyes. And then, I drifted into something that wasn't quite sleep. Suddenly, I was standing on the street outside my grandparents' house. But I wasn't really there. It was like I was floating weightless, detached from my body. The air was thick and still, and everything had an eerie, muted quality to it, like I was inside a dream that wasn't really mine. That's when I saw it. A figure. Tall. Unnaturally lean. Wrapped in a black hooded cloak. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, gliding across the street toward the house. Its face was hidden beneath the hood, but I could feel its presence pressing against me like a wave of cold air. My chest tightened. I watched frozen as it reached the house and entered. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but I was trapped in place. The figure climbed the stairs, step by step, moving with a kind of weightless fluidity. My stomach twisted as it reached the room where my body was lying. Then, just as it was about to enter, I woke up. My heart was racing. My breathing was shallow and erratic. I could still feel the weight of what I had just seen pressing down on my chest. It was a dream. Just a dream. That's what I told myself. But then it happened. A sensation. A shift in the air. A deep, sickening dread wrapped around me, tightening its grip like a cold hand on my throat. I wasn't alone. I could feel something standing at the door. It wasn't a noise. It wasn't movement. It was just there, a presence so heavy it was almost suffocating. My entire body screamed at me not to look. Every instinct I had told me to stay still, to pretend I was asleep, to not see whatever was standing there. But something stronger than fear pushed me forward. I turned my head, and there it was. Tall, lean, its face hidden beneath the hood. But I could see its eyes. Hollow, dark, empty in a way that was more than just the absence of light. They weren't human. They weren't anything. Just voids, deep and endless. Then before I could react, it moved. Not toward me. Not away. It turned into dust. A fine, black mist that drifted soundlessly through the air. And entered me. A violent pressure slammed into my chest. My throat closed up instantly. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't make a sound. My body convulsed as I gasped for air, but nothing came. I was suffocating. A raw, wheezing noise forced its way out of me. My vision blurred. Every nerve in my body was on fire. Then, the lights. Every light in the house turned on at once. A blinding, electric white burst through the darkness, so sudden and intense that it felt like reality itself had shattered. My grandfather was there, his face blurred by my fading vision. He pressed something into my hand. Medicine? Water? And then finally I collapsed. When I woke up, the morning light was spilling into the room, painting everything in soft gold. For a moment, I convinced myself it was just a dream. Just a weird, terrifying dream. Then I saw my arms. Hives. Red, swollen boils covered my skin, angry and irritated. I stared at them, my mind racing. What the hell was happening to me? We went to the doctor later that day. He took one look at me and dismissed it as an allergic reaction. But I knew better. For the next week, the boils remained, a painful, itching reminder of that night. And when they finally disappeared, they left no scars, no marks. Nothing but the weight of knowing that something had happened to me. Something I still couldn't explain. Years passed. I never told anyone what really happened that night. Not in full. The logical part of me wanted to brush it off, to forget. But every once in a while, I would see it. Not close. Never close. Just there. A shadow, lingering at the edge of my vision. A shape, barely visible in the distance. It never moved toward me. It never tried to enter me again. But it watched. And I knew deep in my bones that whatever had happened that night had changed something in me. For the better? For the worse? I still don't know. I don't scare easily. I've had my fair share of weird moments in life, but I can usually rationalize them, brush them off, move on. I'm not superstitious, not religious, none of that. But there's one night that still makes me uneasy whenever I think about it. One of those moments where, even years later, I struggle to make sense of it. It happened when my friend and I were out exploring. We had this habit of checking out abandoned places, just for the hell of it. No breaking and entering, nothing like that, just looking around, seeing how time and neglect had taken over. It wasn't about ghosts or anything, more about the history, the decay, the quiet. There was this old house on the outskirts of town. We'd heard about it before, mostly from other people who had gone in and found nothing but rotting wood and broken furniture. It wasn't some haunted legend or anything dramatic like that. Just an old house, long since condemned, sitting there as the town slowly forgot about it. The stairs were falling apart, the windows were boarded up, but not well. It was the kind of place you knew wasn't safe, but also wasn't exactly off limits. No one cared about it anymore. We got there around midnight. The street was empty, just a long stretch of road with nothing but trees and darkness on either side. No cars, no streetlights. Just silence. The only sound was the occasional rustling of branches when the wind picked up. We stood in front of the house, looking at it for a moment before deciding to go in. The front door was covered by a single plank of wood, lazily nailed across the entrance. Useless. The actual door behind it was unlocked, slightly ajar. Bad planning on someone's part. Maybe whoever had half-heartedly tried to keep people out figured no one would bother coming here. We stepped inside, using our phones for light. The place was exactly what you'd expect. Collapsed ceiling in some spots, broken floorboards, dust thick in the air. The kind of place that hadn't been touched in decades. We kept to the downstairs, knowing the stairs weren't safe. There was a hole in the ceiling above us, leading up to what used to be a bedroom. You could see the tattered remains of old wallpaper up there, peeling off in long strips. After a few minutes of looking around, my friend found an old wooden chair in the corner and sat down. "Might as well chill for a bit," he said, so I leaned back against the wall, sitting on the floor. At first, we just talked about random things, movies, work, the usual, but somehow, the conversation drifted into deeper topics. The kind of talk you only have in the middle of the night, in a quiet place where nothing else is happening. We started talking about the world, how messed up everything seemed. War, crime, the way people treated each other. At one point, my friend said something off-color, something inappropriate, just trying to make light of a dark topic. Then he laughed and said, almost absent-mindedly, "Oh shit, I'm totally going to hell." And that's when it happened. A voice. From the other side of the room, a raspy, older voice said, clear as day, "Speak of the devil, and he shall appear." We froze. Every muscle in my body locked up. The way the voice cut through the air. It wasn't distant, wasn't muffled. It wasn't the wind playing tricks on us. It was close. Someone was in the room. My mind raced. There was no way we hadn't seen someone when we walked in. There weren't many places to hide. The only door out of this room was behind us, the one we had entered through. My friend was the first to react. He snapped his head toward the sound, lifting his phone's flashlight and pointing it toward the doorway. The beam of light landed on something. Someone A man. He was dressed in an old-fashioned suit, dark-colored, with a matching fedora. He was standing in the doorway, facing us. Not moving, just standing there. The moment the light hit him, he turned and walked out the back door. We didn't hesitate. We jumped up and ran after him, sprinting across the rotting floor, pushing through the back door into the open air. Nothing. The road stretched in both directions, empty. No turns, no alleyways, no cover. Just an open road disappearing into the darkness. He was gone. I ran a few steps down the street, looking left and right. My friend did the same, shining his light along the cracked pavement, into the trees, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no distant figure fading into the shadows. It didn't make sense. We stood there, breathing hard, staring into the darkness, trying to wrap our heads around it. "He was right there," my friend muttered. I didn't answer. I just kept looking. Eventually, we turned back to the house, shining our lights through the doorway into the room we had just been in. Empty. No footprints in the dust. No signs that anyone had even been there. The chair my friend had been sitting in was still in the corner. The walls were the same, the floor still cracked and broken. But something about the room felt different. We didn't stay to figure it out. We left, walking fast but not running, keeping our lights pointed at the road ahead of us. Every few steps, we glanced back, half expecting to see him standing there again. But he wasn't. The whole walk back to the car, we barely spoke. We never went back to that house. I've thought about that night a lot over the years. I've tried to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe it was a squatter. Maybe it was some old guy messing with us. But that doesn't explain how he disappeared so fast. It doesn't explain how his voice had that perfect, eerie timing, like he'd been listening to our conversation, waiting for the exact moment to speak. It doesn't explain why, when I think back to that moment, I get the same feeling I had when we first heard his voice. Asterisk, asterisk, like something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Asterisk, asterisk. I don't believe in the devil. I don't believe in spirits or demons or any of that. But that was the one time in my life where, for just a moment, I wasn't so sure. I left Kentucky in the heat of summer, ready to start college in Kansas. My parents drove me out with all my stuff, helping me get settled in before heading back home. Those first few months on campus were strange. I didn't have a car, which meant I was stuck relying on buses, friends, or just walking everywhere. It wasn't the worst thing, but I felt trapped sometimes. The campus was nice, but I missed having the freedom to just go wherever I wanted. That changed in November. For Thanksgiving, I flew home, spent a few days with my family, and then drove my car back to Kansas. It was an 8.5-hour trip, mostly down Interstate 64 and 70. A straight shot, nothing complicated. I'd driven with my parents before, but this was my first time making the trip alone. It felt like a rite of passage, just me, my car, and the long stretch of road ahead. I left home in the afternoon, wanting to make good time and get back before it got too late. But, as these things go, I ended up stopping more than I thought I would. A gas station here, a rest stop there, stretching my legs, grabbing snacks, refilling my drink. Somewhere in the middle of the trip, closer to the Kansas side, I started feeling hungry. I remembered there was a Denny's along the way, one of those 24-hour spots that seemed like a good place to stop. It was late, maybe close to midnight by the time I pulled off the interstate and into the lot. The place wasn't busy, just a couple of cars in the parking lot. Across the road, there was a gas station. It looked old, like something out of a different time, with faded signs and those ancient-style pumps that had the mechanical rolling numbers instead of a digital screen. The whole place had this eerie stillness to it, but I was low on gas, so I figured I'd fill up after I ate. Inside the Denny's, I ordered a meal, nothing fancy, just something to keep me going. While I ate, I kept glancing at the gas station across the road. There was a single light above the pumps, casting a dim glow. An old man was inside the small cashier's booth, barely visible through the grimy window. He wasn't moving much, just sitting there. It felt weird. I don't know why, but something about the place made me uneasy. After I finished eating, I pulled into the station. The second I rolled up, the old man came out. He was thin, with sunken cheeks and a slow, deliberate way of moving. He was wearing an old uniform with a name patch, though I don't remember what it said. Without a word, he motioned for me to stop at the full-service lane. I wasn't expecting that. Most places didn't even offer full service anymore. He unscrewed my gas cap and started pumping. It was one of those pumps where you had to flip the lever to start the fuel flowing. I stepped out of the car and stretched while he worked. The place was dead silent, no sound of cars passing by, no other customers, just the hum of the gas pump. When the pump clicked off, I handed him my credit card. He shook his head, motioning for me to follow him inside. The inside of the gas station was exactly what I expected. Old linoleum floors, faded drink coolers, shelves with dusty snacks. He walked behind the counter, pulled out one of those old-fashioned credit card imprinters, and ran my card through. I hadn't seen one of those in years. He handed me the carbon copy to sign. I grabbed a soda from the cooler, paid, and headed out. I didn't think much about it after that. I got back on the road, made it to Kansas without any issues, and went about my life. A few weeks later, I checked my credit card statement and realized the charge never appeared. The $20 in gas never posted. I figured maybe they ran their transactions at the end of the month or something. It was weird, but I didn't think about it much. Fast forward to Christmas break. I decided to drive home again, and one of my roommates asked if he could come with me. His family was out of the country, and he didn't want to spend the holidays alone. We left in the afternoon, planning to make good time. At some point in the drive, he mentioned he was hungry. I remembered that Denny's and told him there was one up ahead. As we pulled off the interstate, I saw the restaurant just where I remembered. But across the road, where the gas station had been, there was nothing. Just an empty, boarded-up building, weeds growing through the pavement, the old sign rusted and leaning. I stared at it for a long time. It didn't make sense. I had been here just a few weeks ago. I had gotten gas at that station. I had gone inside, signed a receipt, talked to the old man. But now it looked like it had been abandoned for years. The windows were broken, the doors had plywood nailed over them, and the pumps were covered in dust and cobwebs. I parked at Denny's, still looking at the station. My roommate noticed and asked what was up. I told him I had stopped there last month, gotten gas, even went inside. He looked at me like I was crazy. Inside the diner, I asked the waitress when the station had closed. She barely looked up and said, "Oh, that place? Been shut down 4 or 5 years now. Tanks were too old, too expensive to replace." I didn't say anything after that. I just ate my food, paid, and got back in the car. The whole drive home, I kept replaying it in my head. I knew I had stopped there. I could still remember the way the old man moved, how the gas smelled, the weight of the credit cards slip in my hands. But if that place had been closed for years, then where the hell had I been? The part that stuck with me the most wasn't even the gas station itself. It was the missing charge on my credit card. If I had just imagined stopping there, then why had the $20 never shown up? I never found an answer. But to this day, when I drive that stretch of road, I never take that exit again. I woke up to a sound, a heavy, steady banging. It wasn't sharp, like someone knocking on a door, but deep and solid, like something with weight was striking against glass. For a few seconds, my brain was still heavy with sleep, sluggish, trying to make sense of it. I thought I was dreaming. The sound felt distant at first, like it wasn't part of reality yet. I closed my eyes again, shifting under the blankets, expecting it to fade. But it didn't fade. It continued. Bang, bang, bang. Rhythmic, unchanging. It didn't speed up. It didn't slow down. The exact same pressure behind every strike. The exact same timing between each one. Steady, calculated. I opened my eyes again. My room was dark. The faintest sliver of light from the street lamp outside cut through the space between my curtains, but it barely touched anything. I was too groggy to be scared yet. My mind was still trying to hold on to the idea that this wasn't real, that it was some lingering sound from my dream. Then I felt it, a vibration in the air, a deep, low tremor that carried through the walls, through the floor, into my bed frame. The kind of feeling you get when someone slams a door too hard in a quiet house. But it didn't come and go, it stayed. The windows were shaking, and the sound was coming from my window. Now I was awake, fully, completely. I felt it in my chest first. That cold feeling, like ice spreading through my stomach. My body locked up, my muscles tight, like I had to force myself to breathe properly. I could hear my own heartbeat, slow and dull in my ears, but I didn't move. For just a second, one single second, I thought about pulling the curtain back. Just looking, just confirming what was there. But that second passed, and the next thought hit me like a brick. What if someone is looking back? My throat went tight. I felt frozen between two instincts. One side of me screaming to stay still, to be silent, to pretend I was still asleep. The other side yelling that I needed to get out of my room right now. I chose the second option. I threw off my blankets and moved before I could talk myself out of it. The moment my feet hit the floor, I realized my legs felt weak, like I had just sprinted and burned out all my energy. I forced myself forward, barely thinking, and rushed out of my room, pushing my door open faster than I meant to. My mom's room was down the hall. I didn't care if I woke her up in a panic. I needed her awake. I shook her shoulder, and I could barely get words out, my voice uneven. The banging hadn't stopped. We could still hear it. Even in her room, the sound carried through the walls, through the floor, vibrating everything, rattling every window in the house. But it was centralized in my room. The sound wasn't moving. It wasn't coming from somewhere else. It was there, hitting the same exact spot over and over and over. We both got up. I followed her back to my room, keeping close behind her. My heart felt like it was too big for my chest, like I could feel every single beat against my ribs. She walked to my window, and there was nothing there, but the window was still shaking. For a second, it made no sense. I could see the glass trembling, the slight movement catching the dim glow from the outside street lamp. But there was nothing pressed against it, nothing hitting it. No hand, no object. Then something clicked in both of our minds at the same time. It wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from below it. My chest felt hollow when I realized. There was only one thing beneath my window, the basement vent. And that's when a worse thought hit me. That means the sound isn't outside. It's inside, asterisk, asterisk. The steady, rhythmic pounding wasn't coming from the backyard. It was coming from inside the house. The basement. I don't know how long we stood there, just listening. Neither of us moved for a while. The sound kept going, like a metronome. It never sped up. It never changed. Just the same exact force behind every single strike. It was impossible to tell what it was. Too heavy to be something small. Too precise to be something falling. My mom looked at me, and I already knew we were thinking the same thing. Neither of us were going to the basement at 3 in the morning. She grabbed her phone and called my dad. He worked nights, so he wasn't home. I don't remember exactly what she told him. My brain was too clouded at that point, but she was trying to downplay it. Maybe because she didn't want to make it feel worse than it already was. We tried to rationalize it. Pipes, air ducts, the house settling. We threw out every possibility except the ones we didn't want to consider. We left the basement alone, and eventually the noise stopped. The next day, we checked everything. My dad looked through the basement, the vents, every part of the house that could have made the sound. Nothing. We had the house inspected. Nothing. Everything was fine. Everything was normal. Everything was in place. And yet, sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and still, when the air feels too heavy, it happens again. Not every night, not every week, but every so often. That same steady, rhythmic pounding. No explanation. No source. Just something, somewhere, hitting against the metal vent beneath my window. I didn't know about the phone call until I was 12 years old. By then, the killings were already infamous in our suburb. Every kid grew up hearing the same warnings from their parents, teachers, even random adults in the grocery store. Asterisk, don't stay out too late or the Bernies will get you. Asterisk, it was something we all said, half as a joke, half as something that made our stomachs twist just a little. But the fear never felt real until my dad told me the story. It happened when I was just a toddler, 18 months old. Too young to understand what was happening, too young to remember any of it myself. But when my dad told me, when I could finally grasp what could have happened, what almost did happen, the fear settled deep in my chest like something cold and permanent. It started with the missing girls. I don't know if my parents were paying attention to the news at first. Maybe they just thought it was one of those awful things that happen far away, to other people. We were an ordinary family, living in an ordinary house, on an ordinary street. But then, the disappearances started creeping closer. A girl vanished a few blocks away. Then another, even closer. And then one night, the phone rang. My dad answered it. I wasn't awake for it, of course. I was already in bed, probably fast asleep in my crib. He told me years later that he almost didn't pick up. Thought it might be a telemarketer or some drunk dial from a wrong number. But something made him answer. On the other end, a man's voice. Calm, steady, maybe even polite. He told my dad he knew where his daughter was, that she was dead, that he knew where to find her body. I don't know how my dad reacted in the moment. Maybe he laughed. Maybe he swore at the guy. Maybe he just hung up without another word. Whatever he did, he didn't take it seriously. How could he? I was asleep in my room, just down the hall. Safe. It wasn't until later that he saw the name in the newspaper. A girl had been found murdered. Same surname as us. Lived on the same street. That was when he finally reported the call. I don't know if the police ever found out who made it. Maybe it was one of the killers, calling just to taunt someone with bad luck and the same last name. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it was someone who had seen something, knew something, but was too afraid to come forward properly. Whatever the case, the murders continued. 3 more girls were taken, tortured, and killed before the last one finally escaped. That was how they were caught. The final girl. I used to imagine her sometimes, even though I never saw a picture of her. I imagined her tied up in some dark, filthy place. I imagined her pain, her terror. And I imagined the moment she finally got away. I pictured her running, half-dressed, bruised, gasping, pounding on a stranger's door until someone let her in. I imagined her crying, trying to speak, trying to tell them what had happened. I imagined her saving herself, and in doing so, saving every girl who might have been next. When I first heard the story, I couldn't sleep for weeks. Every creak of the house sent my pulse hammering in my throat. Every distant voice outside made me freeze, listening, straining to hear if someone was coming too close. I'd stare at my window at night, wondering if someone was standing just outside, watching. The killers were gone by then, locked away, but the fear wasn't, and neither was the thought that haunted me the most. If things had been just a little different, if the man who called my dad had meant me, would I have been one of the missing girls too? Would I have been another name in the newspaper? Would I have been another body in the ground? The thought never really went away. Even now, I still wonder. I was 17 the night it happened. Old enough to drive, but not old enough to be smart about it. I had my license for just over a year at that point, and I thought I knew everything I needed to know about the road. I had learned how to merge, how to check my blind spots, how to parallel park, though I hated it. And I had figured out that speed limits were more like suggestions than actual rules. I wasn't reckless, but I wasn't careful either. I was just like every other teenage driver who thought they were invincible. That night, I was heading home from a friend's house. It wasn't that late, maybe 10 or 11 p.m., but the roads were mostly empty. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like the whole town has gone to sleep without you. The streetlights gave everything that yellow-orange glow, and the occasional passing car had its high beams on, cutting through the darkness. I only had one more street to go before I made the final turn onto my road, but I was in the wrong lane. I noticed it too late. The intersection was coming up fast, and I was in the right lane when I needed to be in the left. Normally, this wouldn't have been a big deal. I could have just looped around the block, but I was impatient, and young, and stupid. There was a truck next to me. A huge thing, lifted so high it looked like it was meant for off-roading instead of regular streets. It was the kind of truck you'd expect to see covered in mud with deer antlers strapped to the front. I figured I could punch the gas and slip ahead of it, then slide into the left lane just in time to make my turn. I had done riskier maneuvers before, so I didn't think twice. The light turned green, and I floored it. My car lurched forward, the engine roaring as I surged ahead. For a second, I thought I had it. I couldn't see anything in my blind spot, so I twisted the wheel left and went for it. But I wasn't the only one speeding up. The truck gunned it too. I didn't realize it at first. I had already started moving into the lane, expecting to slide in cleanly. But instead of empty space, there was a loud blaring of a horn. A deep, chest-rattling blast that made my stomach drop. My head whipped to the left, and for the first time I saw it. The truck was right there, inches away, massive and unforgiving. I jerked my wheel back into my lane so hard I felt the tires skid. The truck was forced into the turn lane, the exact one I had been aiming for. I had no idea how close I had come to sideswiping him, but from the way his horn was still blaring, I knew it had to be close. My hands clenched the wheel. My heart was hammering, my skin hot with embarrassment and fear. I knew I had screwed up. I had been careless, and I could have caused an accident. I wanted to shrink down in my seat and disappear. But before I could even process what had just happened, I saw movement in the truck. The driver was staring at me. At first, I thought he was just pissed, and I didn't blame him. If someone had nearly run me off the road, I'd be mad too. But this wasn't just an angry look. He wasn't just honking his horn and throwing up his hands like most people would. No, this was something else. Something different. Something dangerous. He started matching my speed. I tried to ignore it. I focused on the road ahead, but every time I glanced to the left, he was still there, staring. Not just a quick glare before moving on, but an unbroken, steady stare. His truck was keeping perfect pace with me, as if we were attached by an invisible tether. I sped up. So did he. I slowed down. He did too. That's when I realized it wasn't just about what had happened back at the light. This wasn't just road rage. He was messing with me now. I swallowed hard, gripping the wheel tighter. My stomach felt like it was twisting in on itself. I could see him clearly now, a big guy, broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and a baseball cap. A woman sat in the passenger seat next to him, but she wasn't looking at me. She was staring straight ahead, as if she had seen this happen before, as if she knew better than to get involved. I needed to get away from him. I scanned the road ahead, looking for an opening. There was a car up ahead in my lane, moving slow. Way too slow. I was going close to 70 in a 35, but this guy was crawling. He had his blinker on, about to make a turn. I couldn't get around him. I was trapped. My breath came in short, shallow bursts as I pressed the brakes, slowing down against my will. The truck next to me slowed down too. The slow car up ahead made its turn. But before I could move forward, the truck jerked right in front of me and stopped. My stomach lurched. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the pavement. My car jolted to a stop just feet from his massive tailgate. I sat there, frozen, my brain scrambling to process what was happening. Then his door opened. The interior light flicked on, casting a dull glow over the pavement. Panic shot through me like an electric current. I threw the gear into reverse, my hands shaking as I twisted in my seat. I barely had time to check behind me before I hit the gas. My tires squealed as I shot backward, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might throw up. But in my panic, I yanked the wheel too hard, and the car lurched sideways. The engine sputtered, and then it stalled. I gasped. My foot slammed the pedal, but the engine just coughed. No. I fumbled with the keys, twisting them in the ignition with shaking hands. My breath hitched in my throat as I glanced up. The guy had stopped. He was halfway out of the truck, one foot on the pavement. His head tilted slightly, like he was considering something. Then, without a word, he stepped back inside and slammed the door. The truck roared to life. He sped off. I sat there, hands clenched so tight around the wheel my knuckles were white. My breath came in ragged gasps. My legs were trembling so badly, I wasn't sure I could even press the pedals. I don't know how long I stayed there. A minute, maybe two, maybe longer. Finally, I forced myself to take a deep breath and turn the key again. This time, the engine came to life. I pulled back onto the road and drove. Not home. I wasn't ready to go home yet. I drove around for a while, letting the adrenaline burn itself out. My brain replayed the moment over and over, dissecting every detail, every decision. I had been stupid to try that move at the light. I had made a mistake. But whatever that guy had planned when he got out of that truck, that had nothing to do with road rage. I never saw him again. But for a long time after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had come far too close to something I wasn't supposed to escape.